A terrified 9-year-old girl, alone and weeping on an isolated Montana backroad as darkness approaches. No one to help her, no shelter in sight. Then, emerging from the golden haze of sunset, a herd of wild mustangs appears, encircling the vulnerable child. Most would assume these powerful untamed animals pose a deadly threat, but what these magnificent creatures do next challenges everything we know about the natural world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Led by a striking Palomino mare with unusually intelligent eyes and a distinctive lightning-shaped marking on her chest, these wild horses form a protective barrier around the frightened girl. When a former rodeo champion witnesses this extraordinary behavior, it sets in motion a chain of events that will uncover long-buried family secrets, unite a divided community, and reveal an astonishing connection between a child and the last remaining Mustang herd in the Copper Creek Valley. As a wealthy energy consortium threatens both the Mustang's territory and the girl's family homestead, unlikely alliances form, including a group of environmental activists and a Native American tribe fighting to preserve their ancestral lands. What unfolds is a story of courage, connection, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals that will leave even the most hardened skeptics questioning what they thought they knew about the natural world. The September sun had begun its descent over the vast Montana landscape, casting long shadows across the winding dirt road that cut through Copper Creek Valley. The air held the crisp promise of fall, carrying the scent of pine and wild sage from the surrounding mountains. It should have been a peaceful evening in one of America's last wild places, but for one small girl, it was the most terrifying moment of her young life. 9-year-old Emma Winters sat huddled by the roadside, her small body trembling as sobs racked her chest. Her bright yellow backpack lay beside her, its contents spilled across the dusty ground. Her jeans were smudged with dirt, and a small tear showed at the knee where she had fallen while running. She'd been walking home from her friend's ranch, taking the shortcut her parents had warned her never to use alone, when she'd spotted a mountain lion in the distance. Panicked, she had run blindly, veering off the trail she knew and onto this unfamiliar road. Now, completely disoriented and with the sun sinking rapidly, Emma was lost. "Mom!" she called out, her voice breaking on the word. "Dad! Anybody!" Only the whisper of wind through the tall grasses answered, carrying her cries away into the emptiness. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into curves that offered no hint of civilization. Emma hugged her knees to her chest, trying to remember what her father, a former park ranger, had taught her about being lost. Stay put. Don't wander. Someone will come looking. But as the shadows lengthened and the temperature began to drop, fear clawed at her throat. What if no one knew where to look? What if the mountain lion found her first? A few tears slipped down her cheeks, carving clean tracks through the dust. On her face, "Please," she whispered to the darkening sky, "I want to go home." That's when she heard it, a soft rumbling sound like distant thunder. Emma froze, holding her breath as she listened. The sound grew louder, resolving into the unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats against dry earth. Her heart pounded as she turned toward the noise, eyes widening as figures emerged from a gap in the golden hills to her right. Wild horses, mustangs. Emma had seen them before, but only from a great distance through her father's binoculars. The locals spoke of them with a mixture of reverence and frustration, beautiful symbols of America's wild heritage, but competitors for the precious grazing land many ranchers felt they needed for their cattle. Now they were here, impossibly close, their powerful bodies moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural in the fading light. Leading them was a striking Palomino mare, her golden coat gleaming like burnished metal in the sunset. A distinctive white, marking shaped like a lightning bolt, blazed across her chest. Emma's breath caught in her throat. There must have been at least 15 horses, moving in perfect synchronicity. Without fully understanding why, she scrambled to her feet, unsure whether to run or stay still. The Palomino slowed, her ears pricked forward, intelligent eyes fixed on Emma with an intensity that seemed almost human. The other mustangs followed suit, gradually forming a circle around the girl. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she spun slowly, finding herself surrounded by the wild creatures. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't hurt me." The Palomino took a step closer, her nostrils flaring as she caught Emma's scent. The girl stood perfectly still, remembering her father's warnings about unpredictable wild animals. The mare was close enough now that Emma could see the sunlight, reflecting in her large, dark eyes, and could feel the warmth of her breath. Then, to Emma's astonishment, the horse gently lowered her head and nudged the girl's shoulder with her muzzle. The touch wasn't aggressive. It felt almost comforting. Smaller Mustang, a chestnut yearling with a white blaze down his face, edged closer, nickering softly. The others maintained their positions, forming what Emma suddenly realized wasn't a trap, but a protective barrier, with her at the center. The realization washed over her like warm water. They weren't here to hurt her. Are you helping me?" she asked, her voice small with wonder. The Palomino mare tossed her head and pawed once at the ground. Emma hesitantly raised her hand, pausing inches from the horse's face. The mare closed the distance, allowing Emma's small fingers to touch her velvety muzzle. A sob of relief escaped the girl's throat. About a quarter-mile down the road, Nate Sullivan's battered pickup truck rattled over the uneven terrain. At 42, with weathered skin that told stories of decades under the Montana sun, and eyes that had seen too much during multiple tours in Afghanistan, Nate wasn't easily surprised. But the scene that his headlights illuminated as he rounded the bend had him slamming on his brakes in disbelief. A circle of wild mustangs, perfectly arranged around what appeared to be a small figure in the center. "What in God's name?" he muttered, squinting through the windshield. Nate had spent his entire life in Copper Creek Valley. Born to a rodeo champion father, he'd followed in those footsteps until a bad fall had shattered his leg and his career. And 10 years ago, he'd seen plenty of wild mustangs in his time, but never behaving like this. As he cautiously stepped out of his truck, leaving the headlights on to illuminate the scene, the mustangs shifted slightly, but didn't flee as wild horses normally would at a human's approach. That's when he clearly saw the child in the center of their circle, a little girl with tear-streaked cheeks and wide, frightened eyes that now held a glimmer of hope at the sight of another human. Standing closest to her was Amber Lightning, as the locals had named the distinctive Palomino mare who led the last wild Mustang herd in the valley. Nate had been watching that mare from a distance for years, fascinated by her intelligence and leadership. Now she stood protectively beside the child, her posture alert but not aggressive. "Hello there," Nate called softly, approaching with the caution he'd learned from a lifetime around horses. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" The girl shook her head, her voice quavering as she replied, "I got lost. I saw a mountain lion and ran. I don't know how to get home." "What's your name?" Nate asked, stopping a respectful distance from the circle of horses. "Emma Winters." Nate felt a jolt of recognition. Winters, as in Claire and Mike Winters, the couple who had purchased the old Henderson homestead last year. The outsiders who had quickly made waves in the community with their vocal opposition to Dixon Energy's plans to expand operations into Copper Creek Valley, operations that would push the already threatened Mustang herd from their traditional range and potentially contaminate the watershed that local farmers and ranchers depended on. "I know your parents, Emma," Nate said gently. I can take you home. To his amazement, Amber Lightning snorted softly and took a step back, creating a path for him to approach the child. The other Mustangs followed her lead, their movements coordinated, with an almost eerie precision. These horses, Emma said, looking up at Nate with wonder in her eyes. They protected me. The big golden one, she's been watching over me. Nate nodded slowly, processing this extraordinary behavior. That's Amber Lightning. She's the lead mare of this herd. And you're right, it seems like they've been protecting you, which is... He paused, searching for words. Remarkable. Wild Mustangs don't usually behave this way around humans. As Nate helped Emma gather her scattered belongings and guided her toward his truck, the girl looked back at the Palomino mare. Thank you, she whispered. Amber Lightning tossed her head, as if acknowledging the child's gratitude, before turning to lead her herd away, but they didn't go far. Instead, as Nate's truck began to move, the entire herd kept pace alongside the road, following at a distance. They're coming with us, Emma said in awe, her face pressed against the passenger window. Nate glanced in his rearview mirror, an uneasy feeling settling in his stomach. Yes, they are, he confirmed. And that's not normal, Emma. Not normal at all. As Nate's truck wound its way through the darkening valley toward the Winters homestead, Emma remained glued to the window, watching the Mustangs keeping pace alongside them. The herd moved with fluid grace over the uneven terrain, never falling. Too far behind, never drawing too close, a golden-dappled escort in the gathering twilight. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. How do you know about Amber Lightning? Emma asked, finally turning away from the window. Nate kept his eyes on the rutted road, but smiled slightly at the question. I've been watching these Mustangs for years. Each one has their own personality, their own story. Amber Lightning showed up in the valley about 7 years ago, wounded, separated from whatever herd she came from originally. She was hurt? Emma's voice filled with concern. Gunshot wound to her shoulder, probably some poacher or someone who thought wild horses were just pests. Nate's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Found her collapsed near Cooper's Creek, barely alive. In the soft glow of the dashboard lights, Emma studied Nate's profile. You saved her, didn't you? Nate hesitated, uncomfortable with the directness of the child's perception. I did what anyone would do. Treated her wound, left food and water. Keep my distance. Wild horses need to stay wild. Never expected her to survive, much less become the leader of the valley's last Mustang herd. Emma nodded solemnly. That's why she trusts you. She remembers. The simple certainty in the girl's voice sent a chill down Nate's spine. He'd spent his entire life around horses, developed an intuition about them that had made him a champion rider before his accident. But the behavior he'd witnessed tonight, wild Mustangs, forming a protective circle around a human child, following a vehicle, went beyond anything he could explain. Your parents know you were out this late? He asked, changing the subject. Emma's face fell. Mom's at a community meeting about the energy company. Dad's probably looking for me by now. She bit her lip. They told me not to take the back trail alone, but Lily's mom was supposed to drive me home from their ranch. Then her baby brother got sick and I said I could walk. I know the way. Her voice grew smaller. But then I saw the mountain lion. Mountain. Lions usually avoid people, Nate said gently. This one was watching me. Its eyes were... Emma shuddered. I ran and got lost. Nate nodded, understanding her fear. Copper Creek Valley had seen an uptick in unusual wildlife behavior these past months. Animals appearing in places they normally avoided, predators growing bolder. Many locals blamed the preliminary work Dixon Energy had started, the constant vibration of their seismic testing equipment, the disruption of natural habitats. the increased traffic on once quiet roads. As they created the final hill, lights appeared in the distance. The Winters homestead, a restored 19th-century ranch house nestled at the base of copper-rich hills that had given the valley its name. Even from here, Nate could see activity in the yard, flashlights moving in patterns. That suggested a search party. "That's my house!" Emma exclaimed, relief flooding her voice. Nate slowed the truck, eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The Mustangs had stopped on the ridge behind them, their silhouettes stark against the last glow of twilight. Amber Lightning stood at the forefront, watching. "Your friends are staying back," he told Emma. The girl twisted in her seat, looking through the rear window. "Will they be okay? What if the mountain lion finds them?" "They know these hills better than any predator," Nate assured her. "Wild Mustangs have survived here for generations." As they approached the homestead, a woman broke away from the group in the yard, running toward the driveway. Claire Winters was in her late 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the determined expression of someone accustomed to overcoming obstacles. The moment Nate's truck rolled to a stop, she yanked open the passenger door. "Emma!" she cried, gathering her daughter into a fierce embrace. "We've been searching everywhere." "Mike!" she called over her shoulder. "She's here! She's safe!" A tall man with a ranger's hat and a flashlight jogged toward them, his face transformed by relief. Behind him, several neighbors with flashlights of their own approached more slowly. "Where were you?" Claire demanded, holding Emma at arm's length to examine her. "We've had search parties out for hours." Before Emma could respond, Mike Winters reached them, immediately dropping to one knee to hug his daughter. "Are you hurt? What happened?" He looked up at Nate, recognition and confusion crossing his features. "Sullivan, you found her?" Nate stepped out of his truck, suddenly aware of his position as an outsider to their family moment. "Found her about 5 miles east near Rattlesnake Ridge." 5 miles? Claire gasped. "How did you get all the way out there?" Emma launched into her story, the mountain lion, her panicked flight, getting lost as darkness fell. When she reached the part about the Mustangs, her parents exchanged the skeptical glances of adults, hearing a child's imagination at work. "The wild horses surrounded you?" Mike asked gently. "They protected me, Dad. The golden one with the lightning mark on her chest. She stood right next to me. She wouldn't let anything hurt me. Mr. Sullivan saw it too." Emma turned to Nate, her expression pleading for confirmation. All eyes shifted to him, among the gathered neighbors. Nate recognized several local ranchers who considered the Mustang herd a nuisance, competitors for grazing land. Others were newcomers who had moved to the valley for its natural beauty, generally supportive of preserving its wild character. The division was subtle but real, a microcosm of the larger conflict tearing at the community. "It's true," Nate said simply. "When I found Emma, the herd had formed a circle around her. Amber Lightning, the lead mare, was standing guard. Never seen anything like it." A murmur ran through the gathered neighbors. Claire's expression softened from skepticism to wonder, while Mike studied Nate with new interest. "You're the horse trainer, right?" Mike asked. "The one who used to ride a rodeo?" Nate nodded, uncomfortable with the attention. "Long time ago. And you know these Mustangs?" Claire pressed. "I observed them," Nate corrected. "They're wild animals. Nobody knows them, not really." Emma broke away from her mother's embrace, looking up at Nate with absolute conviction. "Amber Lightning knows you. She trusts you because you saved her." An awkward silence fell over the group. Finally, one of the neighbors, an older rancher named Bill Hendricks, cleared his throat. "Horses protecting a human child. That's a tall tale, Sullivan. Those beasts are nothing but trouble for legitimate ranchers. Dixon Energy's right. They need to be removed before the new operation breaks ground." "Those beasts kept my daughter safe tonight," Claire shot back, her arm tightening around Emma's shoulders. Mike stepped forward, diffusing the tension with practiced diplomacy. "We're just grateful Emma's home is safe. Thank you for finding Sullivan, would you like to come in for coffee? Least we can do." Nate hesitated, then shook his head. "Should be getting back. Got horses of my own to tend to." He tipped his hat slightly. "Glad the girl's safe." As he turned to leave, Emma broke away from her parents, running to catch his arm. "Wait! What about Amber Lightning and the others?" "The men are coming to take them away, aren't they? Because of the energy company." The directness of the question, spoken with such certainty, caught Nate off guard. He knelt to the girl's level, acutely aware of the watching adults. "Who told you about that, Emma?" "No one had to tell me," she replied, her blue eyes serious beyond her years. "I could feel it when I was with them. They're scared. They know something bad is coming." Mike approached, placing his hands on his daughter's shoulders. "Emma, horses can't tell people things like that, sweetheart." "But they can, Dad," Emma insisted, looking up at her father. "You just have to know how to listen." She turned back to Nate, her expression pleading. "You understand, don't you, Mr. Sullivan? You can hear them too." Nate felt Claire's questioning gaze, saw the skeptical expressions of the gathered neighbors. But something in Emma's certainty resonated with him, echoed his own unexplained connection to horses that had made him a champion rider, the intuition that had led him to find and heal Amber Lightning years ago. "I think," he said carefully, "that you're very observant, Emma. You notice things about animals that most people miss." It wasn't a direct confirmation, but Emma seemed satisfied. She nodded solemnly before allowing her father to lead her back toward the house. As the neighbors dispersed and the Winters family retreated indoors, Nate climbed back into his truck, his mind troubled. When he looked to the ridge where the Mustangs had been watching, they were gone, melted away into the darkness like ghosts. But he knew they were still out there, moving through their ancient pathways across a valley that would soon be unrecognizable if Dixon Energy had its way. And somehow, inexplicably, a 9-year-old girl had become linked to their fate. Dawn broke over Copper Creek Valley, painting the hills in hues of amber and gold. Nate Sullivan stood on the weathered porch of his modest ranch house, coffee mug in hand, watching the horizon. He hadn't slept well, his dreams filled with running. Horses and a child's voice asking questions he couldn't answer. The events of the previous evening had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. In 20 years of observing the valley's wild Mustangs, he'd never witnessed behavior remotely like what he'd seen. A herd deliberately protecting a human, forming a barrier around her, following her at a distance. It challenged everything. He thought he knew about wild horse behavior. The rattling of an approaching vehicle pulled him from his thoughts. A mud-splattered Jeep with the Dixon Energy logo emblazoned on its door was approaching his property, churning up dust along his driveway. Nate's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting this visit, though not quite so soon. The Jeep parked beside his stable, and a man in pressed khakis and a company polo shirt stepped out. Despite the early hour and remote location, Brandon Dixon looked as polished as if he were heading into a corporate boardroom. At 35, he was the youngest son of Dixon Energy's founder and the public face of their expansion into Copper Creek Valley. "Sullivan!" Dixon called, approaching with an extended hand and practiced a smile. "Hope I'm not interrupting your morning." Nate set his coffee mug on the porch railing. "Dixon, bit early for a social call." Dixon's smile didn't falter as his unshaken hand dropped to his side. "Heard you had quite an adventure last night, finding the Winters girl." News traveled fast in small communities, especially news that involved the daughter of vocal opponents to Dixon Energy's plans. "Word gets around," Nate replied non-committally. "Also heard some interesting details. Something about wild Mustangs protecting the child." Dixon's tone was light, but his eyes were calculating. "Sounds like quite a tale." I reported what I saw. Dixon nodded, glancing past Nate toward the paddock where 3 retired rodeo horses grazed peacefully. "You're something of a local expert on horses, aren't you, Sullivan? Before your accident, the bay Reference to the fall that had ended Nate's rodeo career was deliberate, a subtle reminder of past failures. "Did you drive out here at dawn to discuss my resume, Dixon?" The executive chuckled, reaching into his jacket to withdraw a folded document. "Actually, I came with an opportunity. Dixon Energy is prepared to offer you a position as our wildlife consultation specialist. Generous compensation." He extended the paper. "We value local expertise." Nate didn't reach for the document. "Why now?" "Our environmental impact assessment begins next week. Having someone like you on board would add credibility to our findings." "Someone like me," Nate repeated. "You mean someone who's lived here all his life? Someone the locals might trust?" Dixon's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "You'd be a valuable team member. The position includes relocation compensation, of course. We have excellent properties near our headquarters in Denver." Relocation. The word hung in the air between them. "You want me gone from the valley?" "We want you working with us rather than against us," Dixon corrected smoothly, "especially regarding the Mustang situation. The BLM roundup is scheduled for the end of the month. Having your public support would simplify matters." Nate's expression remained impassive, but anger sparked within him. The Bureau of Land Management roundup had been pushed through with suspicious speed after Dixon Energy secured preliminary permits for their operation, an operation that would tear up the Mustang's traditional range for natural gas extraction. "And if I'm not interested," Dixon tucked the unexamined offer back into his jacket. "That would be unfortunate. I understand the bank is reviewing your mortgage situation. Properties in this area have become challenging to maintain for individuals. Tax reassessments alone have driven out several small ranches. The threat was clear: cooperate or lose everything." Dixon's company had been systematically acquiring properties throughout the valley, using a combination of generous offers and behind-the-scenes pressure. Those who refused to sell found themselves facing sudden tax issues, permit problems, or financial difficulties. "I'll need time to consider," Nate said, revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Of course." Dixon's smile returned. "But don't take too long. The situation with those Mustangs is reaching a critical point. After what happened with the Winters girl, people are talking. Some even suggest the roundup should be delayed or cancelled. Because wild horses protected a child instead of harming her. Imagine that." Dixon's expression hardened momentarily before he recovered his corporate demeanor. "Charming stories don't change the facts. Those Mustangs are competing with legitimate ranching operations for limited resources. They're an invasive species, not native wildlife. Mustangs have been in this valley since before there was a United States of America," Nate countered. "They're as much a part of this landscape as the mountains." "Sentimentality is a luxury, Sullivan. Progress requires difficult choices." Dixon turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Stay away from the Winters family. Their opposition to our project is already problematic. We don't need them to find new allies." After Dixon's Jeep disappeared down the driveway, Nate remained on his porch, the conversation playing through his mind. The implied threats weren't surprising. Dixon Energy hadn't become a regional powerhouse by playing nice, but the timing was concerning. Something about Emma's encounter with the Mustangs had clearly rattled them. The ringing of his rarely used landline phone broke the morning stillness. Nate stepped inside to answer it, surprised to hear Claire Winters' voice. "Mr. Sullivan? It's Claire Winters, Emma's mother. I hope it's not too early to call." "Been up for hours," he assured her. "How's Emma?" "Physically fine, but—" Claire hesitated. "Something's happened. The Mustangs are back. They're at our fence line, just standing there. All of them. Emma says, they're waiting for you." Nate gripped the phone tighter. "That's not possible." "I'm looking at them right now," Claire said, an edge of wonder in her voice. "Emma woke up insisting we needed to check the east pasture. Said Amber Lightning was trying to tell her something important. I thought it was just a child processing last night's trauma, but—" She took a breath. "They're here, Mr. Sullivan. Just like she said they would be." 30 minutes later, Nate's truck pulled into the Winters' driveway. The homestead was an impressive restoration of one of the valley's original ranch houses, with modern solar panels that somehow didn't detract from its historical character. A large organic garden stretched behind the house, and the surrounding pastures were dotted with a small herd of grass-fed cattle, the foundation of the sustainable ranching operation the Winters had established. Mike Winters met him at the door, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. "Thanks for coming," he said, extending his hand. "Claire's with Emma at the east fence. Well, you should see for yourself." As they walked toward the eastern boundary of the property, Mike filled Nate in on the morning's events. "Emma woke up at dawn, absolutely insistent that we needed to check the fence line. Said the horses were coming to deliver a message. We thought it was just a dream, but she was so certain. And the Mustangs were there when you checked?" Nate asked. Mike nodded, running a hand through his graying hair. "All of them. Standing, at attention like they're waiting for something, or someone. Never seen anything like it. Brandon Dixon paid me a visit this morning," Nate said abruptly. "Seemed particularly interested in what happened with Emma and the Mustangs." Mike's steps faltered slightly. "Dixon came to your place? Why?" "Offered me a job. Wanted my public support for the BLM roundup. Let me guess. The job requires relocating." "Me far from here," Mike said bitterly. "Classic Dixon tactic. They tried buying us out when we first purchased this place. When that failed, they started pressuring the bank holding our mortgage. Suddenly our loan terms were being reviewed. They created a small rise, and the eastern pasture came into view. What Nate saw stopped him in his tracks. There, lined up along the entire stretch of fence, was the Mustang herd, at least 30 horses standing almost perfectly still, their attention focused on the small figure of Emma, who stood safely on her side of the fence with Claire beside her. Leading them was Amber Lightning, her golden coat catching the morning sun, her intelligent eyes fixed on the approaching men. "They've been like this for over an hour," Mike said quietly. "Not grazing, not moving on, just waiting." As they drew closer, Emma turned, her face lighting up at the sight of Nate. "Mr. Sullivan, you came. I told Mom you would." She pointed excitedly toward Amber Lightning. "She has something to show us, something important." Claire Winters turned to greet them, her initial skepticism clearly shaken by the evidence before her eyes. "I don't understand what's happening," she admitted. "Wild animals don't behave this way." "These ones do," Emma corrected her mother with the absolute certainty only a child could muster. "They're different, special, and they need our help." Nate approached the fence cautiously, his eyes meeting Amber Lightning's. The mare watched him, ears pricked forward, then suddenly tossed her head and whinnied, a high, clear sound that echoed across the valley. At this signal, the entire herd shifted, and to the astonishment of the watching adults, began to move in perfect unison, paralleling the fence line toward the north. After traveling about 50 yards, Amber Lightning stopped and looked back, whinnying again, as if in frustration at their lack of understanding. "She wants us to follow," Emma said, already moving along the fence. "Come on." The adults exchanged glances, but the horse's behavior was so extraordinary that questions of logic seemed suddenly irrelevant. Together, they began walking along the fence line, following the Mustang herd as they led them toward the northwestern boundary of the Winters property. The morning sun climbed higher as they followed the Mustang herd along the fence line. The horses moved with purpose, occasionally pausing to ensure their human companions kept pace. Leading them was Amber Lightning, her golden coat gleaming as she navigated the familiar terrain with confident strides. "Where do you think they're taking us?" Claire asked, helping Emma over a rocky section of ground. I don't know, Mike admitted, but we're approaching the northwest corner of our property. Beyond that is BLM land that borders Dixon's preliminary survey sites. Emma kept her eyes fixed on Amber Lightning. She's worried about something over there, something bad. Nate remained silent, observing the Mustang's behavior with growing fascination. In his decades of experience with horses, he'd witnessed remarkable displays of intelligence, but nothing like this deliberate guidance, this apparent attempt at communication. It challenged everything he thought he knew about the divide between humans and wild animals. After about 15 minutes of walking, they reached the corner of the Winters property where 3 fence lines met. The boundary between private land and public lands administered by the Bureau of Land Management. Amber Lightning halted at this junction, pawing the ground insistently with one hoof. This is as far as we can go, Mike said. That's federal land beyond this point. The Palomino mare nickered softly, moving back and forth along the fence with obvious agitation. Several other Mustangs mirrored her movements, creating a wave-like pattern that emphasized their frustration at the barrier. They want us to cross, Emma said with certainty. Claire shook her head. Honey, we can't just wander onto BLM land, especially not with Dixon Energy conducting surveys out there. They have security patrols. But it's important, Emma insisted, looking up at the adults with pleading eyes. Can't you feel it? They're trying to show us something before it's too late. Nate studied the landscape beyond the fence. The terrain sloped gently downward into a broad valley before rising again toward the copper-rich hills that had given the region its name. In the distance he could make out the glint of metal, likely Dixon Energy's survey equipment. Mike, he said suddenly, doesn't Cooper's Creek run through this section? Mike nodded. Underground for most of it. There's a spring about a half-mile in that direction, where it surfaces briefly before disappearing again. Why? Cooper's Creek feeds into the aquifer that supplies water to half the valley, Nate explained, pieces clicking into place in his mind. Including your property and mine, understanding dawned on Claire's face, and Dixon's operation will be drilling directly through that water table. They claim their process is completely safe, Mike said, though his tone betrayed skepticism. All their environmental impact statements show no risk of contamination. Nate gestured toward the agitated Mustangs. Maybe they know something we don't. Emma tugged at her father's sleeve. Dad, please, we have to look. Amber Lightning says it's really important. The adults exchanged glances, caught between rational caution and the inexplicable certainty of a child who somehow seemed to understand the wild horse's intentions. I could go alone, Nate offered. If there's something to find, I'll document it. Less risk than all of us trespassing. Mike shook his head. This affects my family too. I'm coming with you. He turned to Claire. You should take Emma back to the house. No, Emma protested. They want me to come too. I can understand them better than anyone. It's not safe, Emma, Claire began. Mom, please. The intensity in the 9-year-old's eyes was startling. Amber Lightning protected me when I was lost. She wouldn't lead us into danger now. After a moment of internal struggle, Claire sighed. We stay together. At the first sign of trouble, we turn back. Agreed. Mike looked like he wanted to argue, but finally nodded. We'll need to be quick and quiet. And they found a section of fence with enough space to slip between the wires. Once on the other side, Amber Lightning immediately approached Emma, gently nudging the girl with her muzzle before turning to lead the way across the open terrain. The rest of the herd spread out around them, creating a loose formation that effectively obscured the small group of humans from distant observation. They're hiding us, Nate murmured, amazed at the coordination. Using their bodies as shields, they walked for nearly 20 minutes, following Amber Lightning's lead as she navigated a path that kept them concealed within shallow ravines and behind stands of juniper. The terrain gradually sloped downward, and the soil beneath their feet grew damper. Soon they could hear the gentle gurgling of water. Cooper's spring should be just ahead, Mike confirmed, his voice low. Amber Lightning slowed, her ears flicking, back and forth as she scanned the area. Satisfied they were alone, she led them around an outcropping of rock to where a clear pool had formed, fed by water bubbling up from underground. Cooper's Creek began here, flowing for about 100 yards on the surface before disappearing back into the earth. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The spring looked as it always had, a peaceful oasis in the arid landscape where generations of wildlife had come to drink. "I don't understand," Claire said, looking around. "What are we supposed to be seeing?" Emma knelt by the water's edge, reaching out as if to touch it, but Amber Lightning quickly stepped forward, blocking her with her body. "She doesn't want me to touch the water," Emma said, looking up in confusion. Nate frowned, studying the pool more carefully. Now that he looked closer, he noticed something unusual. A faint rainbow sheen on the surface, almost imperceptible unless the light hit it just right. Moving upstream of the spring, he found what he was looking for, a narrow trickle of discolored liquid seeping into the main water flow from the direction of Dixon's survey site. "Mike!" he called, his voice tight. "You need to see this." Mike joined him, crouching to examine the suspicious seepage. His expression darkened as he dipped a leaf into the substance and watched it dissolve almost immediately. "Chemical runoff," he confirmed grimly. "High concentration too, judging by the reaction," Claire gasped. "But Dixon's operation hasn't even begun actual drilling yet. They're just conducting surveys. Preliminary work includes soil sampling and test bores," Nate explained. "They must have hit something during the process or improperly disposed of their testing chemicals. And it's all draining directly into our water supply," Mike added, his voice hard with anger. "This creek feeds the aquifer that supplies water to most of the valley's ranches and the town's wells." Emma stood nearby, her small hand resting on Amber Lightning's neck. "The horses knew," she said softly. "That's why they brought us here. They've been drinking from this creek for generations. Now it's making them sick." As if confirming her words, Amber Lightning let out a low noise, not quite a whinny, but a sound of distress that sent chills down their spines. "We need to document this," Claire said, pulling out her phone and beginning to take photos of the contamination and its entry point into the spring. "The EPA needs to be notified immediately." Mike nodded, already sending texts to contacts at the county environmental office. This could be enough to halt Dixon's entire operation, at least until a full investigation is conducted. Nate knelt beside Emma, who was still gazing at the contaminated water with sorrow in her eyes. "You were right, Emma. The horses were trying to tell us something important. They knew you would understand," she replied with the simple directness of childhood. "Because you saved Amber Lightning before, because you listen when others don't." Before Nate could respond, a mechanical roar shattered the morning stillness. Coming over the ridge were 2 Dixon Energy ATVs, each carrying armed security personnel. Behind them, in a larger vehicle, was Brandon Dixon himself. "We need to go," Mike urged, pulling Emma away from the spring. "They can't catch us here." But it was too late. The ATVs were rapidly closing the distance, and there was no cover or escape route nearby. They were trapped on open ground, caught in the act of trespassing on federal land where Dixon Energy had survey permits. What happened next left them all speechless. As the vehicles approached, Amber Lightning reared suddenly, letting out a piercing call that echoed across the valley. The response was immediate. The entire Mustang herd, which had been keeping a respectful distance, suddenly converged. Moving with astonishing coordination, they formed a protective wall between the humans and the approaching vehicles. "What do we do now?" Mike asked, his voice low. Nate straightened his shoulders, making a decision. "We stop running. We stand our ground just like they are." He nodded toward the Mustangs. "We've got evidence of contamination. Now it's time to confront Dixon directly. With the Mustangs as our witnesses, Emma added solemnly, as Dixon's security team attempted to maneuver around the living barrier of horses, only to be blocked at every turn. Nate realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, wild. Animals deliberately intervening in human conflict, taking a stand to protect both the humans who had shown them kindness and the land they all called home. And somehow, at the center of this extraordinary alliance was a 9-year-old girl who had found herself lost on a lonely road at sunset, only to discover a connection to the natural world that defied explanation. The standoff at Cooper's Spring stretched into tense silence. On one side stood Brandon Dixon with his security personnel, their ATVs idling noisily. On the other, the Mustang herd maintained their protective formation around Nate, the Winters family, and the contaminated spring. Amber Lightning remained at the forefront, her ears pinned back in warning, her posture radiating defiance. Dixon was the first to break the silence, stepping forward with forced confidence. "Trespassing on permitted land is a federal offense," he called out. "My security team would be well within their rights to detain you until the sheriff arrives." "Feel free to call Sheriff Rankin," Mike replied, holding up his phone. "I just sent him photos of what your preliminary surveys are doing to the valley's water supply." Dixon's smile tightened. "I don't know what you think you've found, but Dixon Energy operates with the highest environmental standards in the industry. Tell that to the chemical waste seeping into Cooper's Spring," Nate countered, gesturing toward the contaminated water. "The spring that feeds into the aquifer, supplying water to 3 towns and a dozen ranches." For just a moment, Dixon's polished facade cracked, his eyes darting toward the spring with genuine surprise. He recovered quickly. "If there's any contamination, it's clearly runoff from local ranching operations. Cattle waste, agricultural chemicals." "Save it," Claire interrupted, stepping forward with her phone. "I've documented the chemical trail directly back to your survey sites. The EPA will have no trouble identifying the source." She turned the screen to show the collection of photos and video she'd captured. Dixon's expression hardened. "This is private property." "It's public land," Mike corrected. "Land you have permits to survey, not pollute." Emma, who had been quietly observing the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "You're hurting them," she said, her clear voice cutting through the tension. "The horses, the deer, everything that drinks from this water, they know it's you making them sick." Dixon's attention shifted. To the child, his expression a mixture of condescension and unease. "Young lady, animals don't understand concepts like corporate responsibility or energy development. They're just animals acting on instinct." "Then explain that," Nate challenged, gesturing toward the Mustang herd still standing in perfect formation. "Explain wild horses forming a protective barrier around humans. Explain them leading us directly to your contamination site. That look like just instinct to you?" Dixon glanced at the horses, momentary uncertainty crossing his features before his corporate training reasserted itself. Obviously, they've been habituated to humans, probably illegally fed, making them lose their natural wariness. Just another reason the BLM roundup is necessary. "These Mustangs haven't been habituated to anything," Nate said firmly. "I've observed this herd for 7 years. They avoid humans completely, except for now, when they're trying to stop your operation from poisoning their home." As the confrontation escalated, one of Dixon's security guards, a former military man named Rodriguez, stepped closer to his boss. "Sir," he said quietly, though his voice carried in the tense silence, "you need to see this." Dixon turned irritably. "What?" Rodriguez pointed toward the spring, where the chemical seepage had grown more pronounced. "That's not ranch runoff, that's drilling fluid. High concentration." "You're not helping, Rodriguez," Dixon hissed. "Sir, my family lives in Pinewood, downstream from here. If that's flowing into the aquifer—" The security guard's professional Demeanor cracked. We need to report this, not cover it up. The exchange revealed the first real fracture in Dixon's control of the situation. Before he could respond, the distinctive wail of sirens echoed across the valley. Minutes later, Sheriff Rankin's patrol vehicle appeared over the ridge, followed by two county environmental officers in a separate truck. Dixon immediately composed himself, ready to present his version of events to the authorities. "Sheriff, I was just about to call you. We've caught these people trespassing on our permitted survey area." Sheriff Rankin, a weathered man in his 50s who had served the county for over 2 decades, took in the scene with practiced neutrality. His gaze lingered on the unusual formation of wild horses before shifting to the Winters family. "Mike, Claire," he acknowledged with a nod. "Your message said something about water contamination?" Before Mike could answer, one of the environmental officers approached the spring, already pulling on protective gloves. "We got your photos," she confirmed, kneeling to examine the oily sheen on the water's surface. "If this is what it looks like—" "It's not from our operation," Dixon interjected smoothly. "We haven't begun any extraction procedures that could possibly—" "Test bore CDIC 117, Rodriguez interrupted, stepping forward despite Dixon's glare. "Started 3 days ago, approximately 300 yards northeast of this position. Drilling fluid disposal protocols weren't followed correctly." The environmental officer looked up sharply. "What type of drilling fluid? What chemical composition?" Rodriguez hesitated, glancing at his furious employer before making his decision. "Proprietary blend, but it contains benzene compounds and methanol, among other additives." "Jesus," the officer muttered, immediately pulling out testing equipment from her pack. "That's directly toxic to humans and wildlife. If it's reached the aquifer—" Sheriff Rankin's typically impassive expression darkened. "Brandon, sounds like we've got ourselves in a situation that goes well beyond trespassing." Dixon's corporate veneer finally cracked completely. "This is ridiculous. A minor technical issue with one test bore does not justify this circus." He gestured angrily toward the Mustangs, who maintained their protective stance. "And since when do we take the behavior of feral horses as evidence of anything?" "Since they saved my life," Emma said, stepping forward despite her mother's attempt to keep her back. "And since they knew exactly where to find the poison you're putting in our water." Dixon stared at the child, momentarily speechless. The sheriff used the opportunity to approach the Mustangs cautiously, his hand extended in a non-threatening gesture. "Never seen anything like this," he murmured, as Amber Lightning regarded him warily but didn't retreat. "These are wild animals, not trained horses. They shouldn't be behaving this way." "They've been trying to tell us something," Emma explained earnestly, "about the water, about their home being in danger. Nobody was listening until now." Sheriff Rankin studied the girl thoughtfully. "The Mustangs that surrounded you on the road, that was this same herd?" Emma nodded. "Amber Lightning protected me." She pointed to the Palomino mare. "She knew I was lost and scared. She brought the others to help me." The sheriff turned to Nate. "Sullivan, you've worked with horses all your life. You're saying these wild Mustangs deliberately led you to a water contamination site?" Nate nodded slowly. "I know how it sounds, but I saw it happen. They formed up at the Winters fence line this morning, got agitated when we wouldn't follow, then led us directly here once we crossed over. I've never witnessed behavior like this in any wild animal." The second environmental officer, who had been taking water samples downstream, jogged back to the group with a grim expression. "Initial readings are off the charts," she reported. "Chemical concentrations high enough to cause immediate neurological symptoms in smaller wildlife. We need to issue a water safety alert for the entire Eastern Valley, effective immediately." Dixon's face had gone pale. "This is an overreaction to a minor containment issue that we were already addressing. Save it for your lawyers, Brandon." Sheriff Rankin cut him off. Right now, my concern is public safety. He turned to his radio, calling in additional units and emergency management personnel. As the situation escalated from confrontation to crisis response, Emma moved closer to Amber Lightning. The Palomino mare lowered her head, allowing the child to gently stroke her muzzle, a moment of connection that seemed impossible between a wild animal and a human. "They understand more than people think," Emma said, looking back at the adults. "They've been watching us for a long time, trying to understand why we're hurting their home." Claire wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Honey, horses don't think that way about humans. They don't analyze our behavior." "These ones do," Emma insisted. "Especially Amber Lightning. She remembers everything. The day Mr. Sullivan saved her. The places where her herd has lived for generations. The new machines and chemicals making her family sick. She remembers, and she understands." As if confirming the child's words, the Palomino mare raised her head and let out a soft, nickering sound. One by one, the other mustangs responded, creating an eerie chorus that sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. "They're talking to each other," Emma whispered, "making a plan." Before anyone could question this extraordinary statement, Amber Lightning suddenly wheeled away from the group, galloping toward the ridge where Dixon's survey equipment was visible. The entire herd followed in perfect formation, their hooves thundering against the earth with such coordination it seemed choreographed. "What the hell?" Sheriff Rankin muttered, watching the Mustang's departure with bewilderment. Emma tugged urgently at Nate's sleeve. "We need to follow them! They're trying to show us something else!" Dixon's face had transformed from concern to alarm. "Stop them!" he shouted at his remaining security personnel. "They're heading straight for the main survey site." Nate exchanged glances with Mike and Claire, a silent decision passing between them. "Sheriff," he said quickly, "I think you should come with us. Whatever these horses are trying to show us, it's important enough that they organize this entire intervention to get our attention." Rankin hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Rodriguez, you're with us. The rest of you stay here with the environmental team and secure this site." He turned to Dixon. "You too, Brandon. I want to see exactly what's happening at your main survey operation." As they hurried toward the vehicles, Emma glanced back at the contaminated spring, then up at the adults, with solemn eyes that seemed far older than her 9 years. "This is just the beginning," she said quietly. "Amber Lightning says there's much worse ahead if we don't stop it now." The certainty in her voice, combined with the unprecedented behavior of the wild mustangs, created a moment of shared unease among the adults. Something extraordinary was unfolding in Copper Creek Valley, something that challenged the boundaries between human understanding and wild instinct, between the calculated logic of corporate development and the ancient wisdom of creatures who had called this land home for centuries, and somehow a child who had been lost and afraid just 24 hours earlier now stood at the center of it all, translating between two worlds that had never before found a common language. The convoy of vehicles followed the Mustang herd at a respectful distance as they galloped across the rolling landscape. Sheriff Rankin led in his patrol car, with Nate's truck behind him carrying the Winters family. Dixon and Rodriguez brought up the rear in one of the company ATVs, the energy executive growing visibly more agitated with each passing mile. "This is absurd," Dixon protested from the passenger seat of the ATV. "We're chasing wild horses across federal land based on what? A child's fantasy that she can talk to animals?" "Sir, with respect," Rodriguez replied, keeping his eyes on the terrain ahead, "something's not right about this situation. I've been working security at extraction sites for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what's happening at Cooper's Spring." The security guard's voice held a note of something Dixon wasn't accustomed to hearing from his employees. Doubt, perhaps even accusation. "The contamination is an isolated incident," Dixon insisted. "Likely the result of one technician's error." Rodriguez didn't respond, his silence more damning than any argument. Ahead of them, Emma sat between her parents in Nate's truck, her eyes fixed on Amber Lightning's golden form leading the herd. "They're taking us to the big machines," she said softly, "the ones that make the ground shake at night." Claire exchanged a worried glance with Mike over their daughter's head. "Emma, honey, how could you possibly know that?" "Amber Lightning showed me," Emma replied simply. "When she touches her head to mine, I can see what she sees." Mike's brow furrowed. "When did she touch her head to yours?" "In the spring," Emma said. "And before that, when they found me on the road. She shares her memories with me." The matter-of-fact way she described this impossible connection sent a chill through her parents. This went beyond a child's active imagination or even the special empathy children sometimes developed with animals. Emma was describing something different. Nate, who had been listening quietly as he drove, finally spoke. "There's an old story my grandfather used to tell. He was half Blackfeet and learned it from his mother, about children who could speak with the spirits of animals, serve as a bridge between worlds when great danger threatened the land." "Sullivan, please," Mike began, not wanting to encourage what he saw as fantasy. "I'm not saying I believe in old legends," Nate continued. "I'm saying that what we're witnessing defies rational explanation. Wild horses don't behave this way. They don't protect lost children. They don't lead humans to contamination sites, and they certainly don't organize themselves into tactical formations." He met Mike's eyes briefly in the rearview mirror. "Something extraordinary is happening here. Maybe we should stop trying to force it to make sense." The convoy crested a hill, and suddenly the landscape opened up before them. In the valley below sat Dixon Energy's main survey camp, a collection of temporary structures, heavy machinery and drilling equipment spread across several acres. Workers in hard hats moved between stations, while large trucks carried equipment and supplies in and out of the site. What caught everyone's attention, however, was not the expected industrial activity. It was the complete halt of operations as every worker stood frozen, staring at the approaching Mustang herd. The horses had formed a perfect line along the ridge overlooking the site, standing motionless like sentinels. "My God," Claire whispered. "They look like they're judging us." Sheriff Rankin pulled his patrol car to a stop and stepped out, his hand resting cautiously on his holster as he surveyed the scene. "What in the world is going on here?" The site foreman, a burly man named Garrett, approached with obvious relief. "Sheriff, thank God you're here. These wild horses showed up about 20 minutes ago. They're disrupting operations, making the workers nervous." "Seems like today's the day for disruptions," the sheriff replied dryly. "We've got a major chemical leak at Cooper's Spring that's been traced back to your test bores." The foreman's expression shifted from relief to concern. "That's not possible. We follow strict containment protocols for all—" "Save it, Garrett," Dixon interrupted, climbing out of the ATV. "There's been a minor technical issue that's being addressed. Nothing that justifies this circus." He gestured angrily toward the Mustangs lined up on the ridge. Emma had exited Nate's truck and now stood gazing up at the horses with an expression of deep concentration. Suddenly, she pointed toward the far side of the camp. "There," she said, firmly, "behind those big metal containers. That's what Amber Lightning wants us to see." All eyes followed her gesture toward a row of large shipping containers that appeared to be serving as temporary storage. "That's a restricted area," Dixon said immediately. "Proprietary equipment, no unauthorized personnel." Sheriff Rankin's eyes narrowed. "Brandon, given the circumstances, I think we'd better have a look." "You'll need a warrant," Dixon countered, his composure cracking. "Not if we have probable cause," the sheriff replied. "And I'd say a major chemical leak upstream, combined with the bizarre behavior of wildlife, constitutes exactly that." As they argued, Emma suddenly broke away from the group, running directly toward the containers in question. Claire called out in alarm, But before anyone could stop her, the entire Mustang herd descended from the ridge in a coordinated movement, flowing around the child protectively as she ran. "Emma!" Mike shouted, sprinting after his daughter with Nate close behind. Dixon cursed under his breath, then turned to Rodriguez. "Stop them!" The security guard hesitated, clearly torn between following orders and his growing suspicions about what might be happening at the site. Finally, he shook his head. "I think we'd better see what's back there, sir." The confrontation rapidly escalated into a chaotic pursuit across the survey site. Workers scattered as the Mustang herd moved through the camp with astonishing precision, creating a living corridor for Emma to run through unimpeded. Dixon shouted into his radio for additional security, while Sheriff Rankin called for backup of his own. Emma reached the shipping containers first, the Mustangs forming a protective semicircle around her as she examined the heavy padlocked doors. Amber Lightning stood directly beside her, pawing urgently at the ground. "It's in here," Emma called out as the adults caught up. "Something really bad." Mike arrived breathless, grabbing his daughter's shoulders. "Emma, you can't just run off. Like that." Nate approached the container, examining the heavy-duty locks and security measures. "This is military-grade security for a simple survey operation," he observed. Dixon arrived with Rodriguez and several workers. "This area is restricted," he insisted, placing himself between the group and the container. "These units contain sensitive equipment that—" He was interrupted by the arrival of the environmental officers from Cooper's Spring, their expressions grim. "Sheriff," the lead officer called, "the contamination is spreading faster than expected. Initial tests show it's not just drilling fluid. There are compounds we can't even identify in the water." Sheriff Rankin turned to Dixon. "Open the containers." "Brandon, now." "I refuse," Dixon said, drawing himself up. "This is corporate property, and you have no jurisdiction to—" The sheriff cut him off by drawing his weapon. "As the chief law enforcement officer of this country facing a potential public health emergency, I am ordering you to open these containers immediately." For a tense moment, Dixon seemed ready to refuse again. Then Rodriguez stepped forward, pulling a key ring from his pocket. "I'll open them, Sheriff." "Rodriguez, you're fired," Dixon snapped. "Better unemployed than complicit," the security guard replied, moving toward the padlocks. As the first container door swung open, a collective gasp rose from the assembled group. Inside were not drilling supplies or survey equipment, but rows of industrial barrels clearly labeled with hazardous waste symbols. "What the hell is this?" Sheriff Rankin demanded. The environmental officer pushed forward, examining the labels with growing horror. "These are banned substances. Chemicals so toxic they're not even legal to use in the United States anymore." She turned to Dixon, her expression incredulous. "You're storing these at a survey site? In unsealed containers near a major water source?" Dixon's face had drained of color. "I don't know anything about this. Someone must have opened the other containers," the sheriff ordered. Each successive container revealed more damning evidence, not just stored chemicals, but empty barrels with residue, makeshift disposal equipment, and detailed logs tracking midnight dumping operations in remote areas of the valley. They've been using the survey operation as cover for illegal waste disposal, the environmental officer realized, charging other companies to take these banned substances off their hands, then dumping them into the ground here to avoid proper disposal costs. Sheriff Rankin holstered his weapon and pulled out his handcuffs. "Brandon Dixon, you're under arrest for illegal dumping of hazardous materials, contamination of public water sources, and endangering public health." "This is ridiculous," Dixon sputtered as the cuffs were applied. "I'm the vice president of operations. I don't handle waste management details. I knew nothing about this." "The logs say otherwise," the environmental officer reported, flipping through a binder found in one of the containers. "Your signature authorizes every delivery and disposal." As Dixon was led away to the patrol car, Rodriguez approached Nate. And the Winters family. I should have spoken up sooner, he admitted. There were rumors among the security team about late-night operations, areas we were told to avoid during certain hours. I never imagined it was anything like this. How did you know? Claire asked Emma, her voice barely above a whisper. How could you possibly have known what was in these containers? Emma looked up at her mother with those unnervingly wise eyes. I didn't, she said simply. Amber Lightning did. The horses found one of the secret dumping sites in the canyon where they sheltered during storms. 3 of their foals died after drinking from a pool there last spring. They've been watching, learning, trying to understand where the poison was and coming from. The adults exchanged troubled glances, confronted with a reality that defied conventional understanding. Nearby, Amber Lightning stood watching them, her intelligent eyes seeming to confirm every word the child spoke. The real question, Nate said quietly, is what happens now. Dixon Energy won't just disappear because one executive gets arrested. Companies like that have layers of protection. And the BLM roundup is still scheduled, Mike added. With or without Dixon's operation, the Mustangs are still slated for removal. Emma reached out to stroke Amber Lightning's muzzle, the wild mare standing perfectly still for her touch, a miracle in itself. We can't let that happen, she said with quiet determination. They saved me, now we have to save them. News of Brandon Dixon's arrest and the discovery of illegal toxic waste spread through Copper Creek Valley like wildfire. By evening, the Winters homestead had become an impromptu command center for the unfolding crisis. Environmental specialists from the state agency had arrived to coordinate testing and containment efforts. Sheriff Rankin had set up a temporary operations post in the living room to manage the investigation, while concerned neighbors and ranchers filtered in and out, seeking information about water safety. Amid this controlled chaos, Nate Sullivan sat on the porch steps, watching the horizon where the Mustang herd had retreated after the confrontation at the survey site. Though no longer visible, he could sense they hadn't gone far, as if they were watching, waiting to see how the humans would respond to the revelations they had helped uncover. Mind if I join you? Nate looked up to find Rachel Blackhawk, a wildlife biologist from the Mountain Heritage Conservation Group, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She had arrived with the environmental response team, but seemed to operate independently from the government officials. Free country, Nate replied, accepting the offered coffee. Rachel settled beside him, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, her keen eyes scanning the same horizon he'd been watching. In her early 30s, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in both wilderness and academic settings. So, she said after a moment, wild Mustangs forming protective circles around lost children and leading humans to environmental crimes. Not exactly standard wildlife behavior. Nate took a sip of coffee. Not even close. You've observed this herd for years, right? Ever seen anything that might explain this level of coordinated behavior? Nothing, Nate admitted. They've always been typical wild horses, wary of humans, territorial with other herds, focused on survival. Until Emma. They both glanced toward the barn, where Emma sat on a hay bale, speaking animatedly to 2 university researchers who had arrived to document the incident. Despite the traumatic discoveries of the day, the child seemed energized, eager to share her experiences with anyone who would listen. There are stories in my tribe, Rachel said carefully, about children who could speak with animals. Spirit bridges, they called them. They only appeared in times of great change or danger. Nate studied her. You believe those stories? I'm a scientist, Rachel replied with a slight smile. I believe in observable phenomena, and what I've observed today defies any scientific explanation I can think of. She turned to face him fully. Do you know why I came here today, Mr. Sullivan? To investigate the toxic waste situation, I assumed. She shook her head. I came because of a video that's been circulating since this morning. A local teenager filmed the Mustang herd forming a circle around Emma on the Ridge Road yesterday. It went viral overnight. Rachel pulled out her phone, showing him the footage, shaky but clear enough to see the extraordinary behavior of the wild horses protecting a small human figure. Jesus, Nate muttered. I had no idea someone recorded that. Over 2 million views already, Rachel confirmed. People are calling it a miracle, claiming it's proof of animal intelligence beyond what science recognizes. She pocketed her phone. But I'm more interested in what it means for the herd's future. The BLM roundup, Nate said grimly. Scheduled. For 10 days from now, Rachel nodded, unless something changes. Mike Winters emerged from the house looking exhausted but determined. He acknowledged Rachel with a nod before turning to Nate. Sheriff wants to speak with us. They're discussing next steps for the contamination response. Inside, the living room had been transformed into an incident command post. Maps of the valley covered the dining table, marked with red pins indicating suspected dumping sites. Sheriff. Rankin stood conferring with the lead environmental officer, while Claire helped coordinate calls from concerned residents. The situation's more extensive than we initially thought, the sheriff explained once everyone had gathered. Based on the logs we found, Dixon Energy has been conducting illegal dumping operations for at least 18 months. We've identified 7 potential sites so far. Most are in remote areas that drain into the watershed, the environmental officer added. Preliminary testing shows containment has failed at least 3 locations. We're looking at a significant remediation effort. What about Dixon himself? Claire asked. Still in custody, Rankin replied, but his lawyers arrived an hour ago. Companies already issuing statements claiming he was a rogue operator acting without corporate knowledge. Convenient, Nate muttered. What about the horses? Emma's voice came from the doorway, where she had slipped in unnoticed. Are they still going to take them away? The adults exchanged uncomfortable glances. The BLM roundup is still scheduled, Rachel confirmed gently. The federal permits operate independently from the county investigation. Dixon Energy's legal issues don't automatically protect the Mustangs. Emma's face fell. But they helped us. They showed us the bad things happening. It's not fair. No, it's not, Rachel agreed. But we might have options. The video of what happened on the Ridge Road has people talking. Sometimes public attention can change outcomes, especially when it generates enough pressure. We need more than public sentiment, Mike said pragmatically. We need legal grounds to challenge the roundup. A knock at the door interrupted the discussion. Claire answered to find a group of unexpected visitors, 3 members of the Northern Shoshone Tribal Council, led by an elder named Joseph Redfeather. We heard about what happened, Joseph explained after introductions were made. About the child and the Mustangs? We felt we should be here. Rachel greeted the elder with obvious respect. Joseph is a cultural historian, she explained to the others. He's been documenting the traditional relationship between indigenous peoples and the wild horses of this region for decades. Joseph's weathered face creased in a gentle smile as his eyes found Emma. So you're the one the horses chose to speak through? Emma approached him without hesitation. You believe me? That I can understand them? Of course, he replied simply. Such children have appeared before in our history. Usually when the balance between worlds has been threatened. Rather than dismissing the elder's words as superstition, Sheriff Rankin leaned forward with interest. Mr. Redfeather, your tribe has made claims about the cultural significance of this particular Mustang herd before, haven't you? Joseph nodded. For generations. These horses are descendants of those brought by the Spanish, but they became integral to Shoshone culture long before American settlers arrived. We've argued they should be protected not just as wildlife, but as living cultural heritage. That could be our angle, Rachel said, excitement building in her voice. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act includes provisions for culturally significant animals and sites. If the Shoshone Nation formally claims this herd as part of their cultural heritage, "We've tried before," Joseph reminded her. "BLM rejected our petition 3 years ago, said we lacked sufficient documentation of this specific herd's lineage." "But that was before," Emma said, her clear voice cutting through the adult conversation. "Before they showed everyone what they can do." The room fell silent as they considered the child's words. She's right, Nate realized. The video evidence of the herd's behavior, combined with what happened today at the survey site, it's unprecedented. No wild horses have ever demonstrated this level of apparent cooperation with humans. "We'd need genetic testing to prove heritage lineage," Rachel added thoughtfully. "Hair samples, ideally blood work." Emma's face brightened. "Amber Lightning would let us. I know she would. She wants to help." Rather than dismissing the child's claim, Joseph nodded seriously. "The young one may be right. If the lead mare has chosen to communicate through her, she might allow such testing." Claire, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "Are we really discussing this? Basing a legal strategy on the idea that wild horses would voluntarily submit to genetic testing because my 9-year-old daughter says they will?" "After what we've witnessed today," Sheriff Rankin said quietly, "I'm not sure what's impossible anymore." Mike placed a supportive hand on his wife's shoulder. "I know how it sounds, Claire, but we've all seen Emma with these horses. Something extraordinary is happening, something none of us can fully explain." As the discussion continued, a commotion outside drew their attention. They stepped onto the porch to find several trucks and cars pulling into the driveway. Local ranchers, environmental activists, and even members of the town council were arriving, drawn by the unfolding crisis and the stories spreading through the community. Among them was Bill Hayes, one of the valley's most prominent cattle ranchers and a longtime supporter of removing the Mustangs to free up more grazing land. He approached with uncharacteristic hesitancy. "Winters," he acknowledged Mike with a nod. "Heard about what happened today, the Dixon situation, the water contamination." He cleared his throat. "My wells pull from that same aquifer. Got grandkids drinking. That water. Testing teams are working on containment," Mike assured him, "but it's extensive." Hayes glanced toward Emma, who stood watching from the porch steps. "Also heard about what happened with your girl and those Mustangs. Saw the video." He shifted uncomfortably. "Never been a friend to wild horses, as you know. Consider them competition for grazing rights, but what they did, protecting a child, then leading you folks to that toxic waste operation." He shook his head in wonder. "Makes a man reconsider some things." As more community members arrived, it became clear that a significant shift was occurring in Copper Creek Valley. People who had been divided over land use, development, and the fate of the wild Mustangs were finding common ground in the face of environmental threat and the extraordinary story of Emma and the horses. By nightfall, the Winters homestead had become the center of an unlikely alliance. Ranchers and environmentalists, tribal representatives and local officials, all unified by the dual challenges of addressing the contamination and protecting the Mustang herd. That had helped reveal it. Standing slightly apart from the gathering, Nate watched as Emma moved confidently among the adults, her small voice somehow carrying weight, even in discussions about legal strategies and environmental remediation. The child had been transformed by her experience with the Mustangs, no longer simply a 9-year-old girl, but a bridge between worlds, just as Joseph Redfeather had suggested. As if reading his thoughts, Rachel Blackhawk appeared beside him. "It's happening, isn't it? What your grandfather's stories talked about, a child serving as a messenger between species when great danger threatens the land." Nate nodded slowly, his worldview continuing to shift in the face of undeniable evidence. "The question is whether we're willing to listen to the message, Dawn broke over Copper Creek Valley, revealing a transformed landscape. Overnight, a small tent city had sprouted around the Winters homestead. Environmental testing teams, media crews, activists, and concerned locals, creating an impromptu command center for both the contamination crisis and the effort to save. The Mustang herd. Nate Sullivan arrived early, his truck kicking up dust as he pulled into the already crowded driveway. He found Mike Winters on the porch, reviewing documents with Rachel Blackhawk and Joseph Redfeather. "Morning," Nate greeted them, accepting a mug of coffee from Claire, who emerged from the house with a tray. "Quite the gathering you've got here." "And growing," Mike confirmed. "The story hit national news this morning. We've got calls coming in from major networks, environmental groups, wild horse advocates. Dixon Energy's PR team is in full damage control," Rachel added, sliding a tablet across the table. The screen showed a press release with the company logo, Dixon Energy cooperating fully with authorities regarding unauthorized activities by former VP Brandon Dixon. "Former," Nate noted dryly. "That was quick. They're trying to distance themselves." "From the contamination," Claire said, claiming it was all Brandon's unsanctioned operation. "The company's still pushing for the development to continue," Mike added. "They've already appointed a new regional VP who's meeting with county commissioners today." Joseph Redfeather tapped a different document on the table, "which is why our petition is so urgent. We need to establish the cultural and historic significance of this specific Mustang herd before the BLM roundup proceeds. And for that we need genetic evidence," Rachel explained. "Hair samples at minimum, blood work ideally." "From wild Mustangs," Nate said skeptically. "Animals that normally won't let humans within 50 yards. All eyes shifted to the barn, where Emma sat cross-legged on a hay bale, deep in conversation with a university ethnobiologist who was recording her description of her interactions with the Mustangs. "Emma says they'll cooperate," Claire said, her voice carrying a mixture of maternal concern and wonder. "She's been saying it since yesterday." "The question is, how and where," Mike added. "We can't exactly invite federal officials to watch us trespassing on BLM land to approach wild horses." "What about your sanctuary?" Rachel asked Nate. "You rehabilitated injured wild horses there before, didn't you?" Nate shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't actively used his property as a rehabilitation center for over a decade. Not since his rodeo. Injury had left him with chronic pain and a deepening isolation from the community. "It's not exactly operational anymore," he admitted. "But the facilities are still there," Mike pressed. "The paddocks, handling equipment." "Barely maintained," Nate argued. "And even if they were in perfect condition, how do you propose we get wild Mustangs to voluntarily enter a sanctuary? We ask them." Emma's voice came from behind them. She had approached unnoticed, her small face alight with certainty. "Amber Lightning will bring them if we invite her." The adults exchanged glances, the familiar discomfort of rational minds confronting something beyond their understanding. "Emma," Claire began gently, "even if you have a special connection with the lead mare, wild horses don't just—" "Can I show you something?" Emma interrupted, holding up a tablet. "Dr. Kalani helped me search for stories about horses helping people. The ethnobiologist, a woman of Hawaiian ancestry with a warm smile and gentle manner, stepped forward. There are actually numerous documented cases throughout history of unusual behavior in horses during crisis situations," she explained. "Most are dismissed as coincidence or anthropomorphizing, but the patterns are intriguing." Emma scrolled through images on the tablet, newspaper clippings, historical accounts, photographs. This one saved a family from a fire in California by waking them up, banging on their door with his hoof. This one led rescuers to a hiker trapped under rocks in Colorado. This one stood over an injured rider for 6 hours, keeping coyotes away, until help arrived. Those are mostly domestic horses, Rachel pointed out gently. Animals that lived with humans formed bonds with them. Not all of them, Emma countered, scrolling to another image. This herd of wild horses in Nevada led firefighters to a missing child during a wildfire in 2012. The officials said it was a coincidence, but the horses circled the girl just like Amber Lightning's herd circled me. The ethnobiologist nodded. There's a growing body of research suggesting that equine cognition and emotional intelligence may be far more complex than previously understood. They're extremely social animals with sophisticated communication systems. Communication is one thing, Mike said. Leading humans to environmental crimes and voluntarily submitting to genetic testing is quite another. Emma looked up at her father with those disconcertingly wise eyes. Dad, remember when you taught me chess? You said sometimes you have to trust that your opponent is thinking many moves ahead, even if you can't see their strategy yet. Yes, Mike agreed cautiously. That's what Amber Lightning is doing, Emma said simply. She's thinking ahead. She understands more than you think. Before anyone could respond, a commotion erupted at the edge of the property. People were pointing and calling out, cameras raising to capture something on the eastern ridge. Emma's face lit up immediately. They're here, she exclaimed, already running toward the pasture fence. The adults followed quickly, joining the growing crowd of onlookers. There, on the ridge overlooking the Winters homestead, stood the entire Mustang herd, their silhouettes stark against the morning sky. At their center, clearly visible despite the distance, was Amber Lightning, her golden coat catching the sunlight. Remarkable timing, Dr. Kalani murmured, filming the scene with her phone. Or remarkable listening comprehension, Rachel added. Watching Emma wave excitedly to the horses, the Mustangs began to descend the ridge, moving with their characteristic fluid grace toward the eastern fence line of the property. Unlike their previous approach, there was no hesitation in their movements. They came directly, purposefully, stopping only when they reached the fence that separated the Winters land from open range. Emma turned to Nate, her expression pleading. Mr. Sullivan, we need to invite them to your sanctuary. Today they're ready. Nate stared at the assembled wild horses, particularly at Amber Lightning, who seemed to be watching him specifically with those intelligent eyes. Everything about this situation defied his understanding of wild animal behavior, yet the evidence was literally standing before him. How would we even transport them? He asked, his practical mind struggling with logistics. We'd need trailers, proper handling equipment. I've got 3 stock trailers, Bill Hayes offered, stepping forward. And my hands are experienced with moving horses. My brother runs Blackfoot Transport, Joseph Redfeather added. He can provide 2 more trailers and drivers by noon. One by one, community members volunteered resources, expertise, and assistance. The impossible plan was rapidly becoming possible through the collective effort of people who, just days ago, had been divided over the very existence of the Mustang herd. Sheriff Rankin approached, surveying the scene with a mixture of official concern and personal wonder. I should point out that removing wild horses from federal land without BLM authorization is technically illegal, he said, then added more quietly, though given the extraordinary circumstances and pending tribal heritage claim, I imagine we could classify this as a temporary protective action during an environmental emergency. We need to document everything, Rachel insisted. Video, photographs, genetic samples, behavioral observations, all of it properly witnessed and verified by qualified experts. And we need permission, Emma said firmly, looking up at Nate. All eyes turned to him. As the owner of the only suitable facility within miles, the decision ultimately rested with him. Opening his sanctuary meant ending his isolation, confronting painful memories and potentially facing legal consequences. Yet, as he met Amber Lightning's steady gaze across the fence line, something shifted within him. A connection he'd thought long broken beginning to repair itself. All right, he said finally. Let's do this. The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. Trailers were brought in and positioned. Temporary chutes were constructed to create a safe loading area. Experts from the university and tribal lands arrived to assist with documentation and sampling. Media crews set up cameras to capture what everyone recognized would be either an historic achievement or a very public failure. Through it all, the Mustang herd remained at the fence line, watching. With apparent interest, as the humans prepared, Amber Lightning stood closest, occasionally nickering softly when Emma approached to give her updates on their progress. By early afternoon, everything was ready. A careful path had been created from the fence line to the waiting trailers, with minimal stress points and no sharp corners that might spook the sensitive animals. Experienced handlers were positioned strategically but unobtrusively. Scientists stood ready with their collection kits for hair and blood samples. The moment of truth had arrived. Would wild mustangs, animals that had evolved over centuries to fear and avoid human handling, voluntarily enter trailers to be transported to Nate Sullivan's sanctuary? Emma took a deep breath, then turned to the assembled adults with solemn determination. "Open the gate," she said. "It's time." A hush fell over the gathered crowd as Mike Winters slowly opened the gate, separating his property from the open range. The barrier between wild and domestic now stood ajar, an invitation rather than a command. Everyone held their breath. Cameras, rolling scientific instruments ready. Emma stepped forward, standing just inside the opening. Her small frame seemed impossibly fragile against the backdrop of powerful wild horses, yet she showed no fear. With a confidence that belied her 9 years, she extended her hand toward Amber Lightning. "It's okay," she said softly. "We're going to help you, all of you." For a long moment nothing happened. The Mustangs remained still, their ears flicking nervously, nostrils flaring as they assessed this unprecedented situation. Skeptical murmurs began to rise from the observers. Perhaps this had been wishful thinking after all, the magical connection between child and wild horses reaching its practical limits. Then Amber Lightning moved. The Palomino mare stepped forward deliberately, her hooves crossing the invisible boundary that had separated her world from the human realm. With regal dignity, she approached Emma, lowered her head, and gently pressed her muzzle against the girl's outstretched palm. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Cameras clicked rapidly. Dr. Kalani whispered observations into her recorder, while Rachel Blackhawk furiously took notes of this extraordinary behavior. "She's agreeing," Emma announced as if translating. She looked back at the adults with absolute certainty. "She understands what we're trying to do." With that, Emma began walking slowly down the pathway they had created toward the waiting trailers. Amber Lightning followed, maintaining a respectful distance, but showing none of the panic or resistance wild horses typically display when being moved toward confinement. Even more remarkably, one by one, the rest of the Mustang herd began to follow their leader. Young colts, experienced mares, the few bachelor stallions that accompanied the family groups, all moved in orderly fashion behind Amber Lightning, placing their trust in her judgment. Nate watched in awestruck silence, his decades of horse experience offering no framework to understand what he was witnessing. These weren't trained animals responding to familiar cues. These were wild mustangs, voluntarily walking into a human-created path toward temporary captivity, apparently understanding that this confinement served some greater purpose. "I've never seen anything like this," Bill Hayes murmured beside him. The veteran rancher's weathered face reflected the same wonder everyone felt. "Not in 50 years of working with horses." As Emma led Amber Lightning to the first trailer, Dr. Sarah Evans, the veterinarian who had volunteered to collect the genetic samples, stepped forward cautiously. "Emma," she said gently, "may I approach her now for the samples?" Emma nodded, turning to the mare. "Amber Lightning, this lady needs some of your hair and a little bit of your blood. It won't hurt much, and it will help us prove that you belong." Here, to the astonishment of everyone present, the wild mare stood perfectly still as Dr. Evans carefully collected several strands of her mane and tail. When the veterinarian prepared the small needle for a blood sample, Amber Lightning flinched, slightly but remained steady. "This is completely unprecedented," Dr. Evans said, her professional demeanor briefly cracking with emotion as she secured the precious samples. "Wild mustangs simply don't allow handling like this without sedation or restraint." After the samples were collected, Emma guided Amber Lightning toward the trailer ramp. Here was the ultimate test. Would a wild horse voluntarily enter such a confined space? Even the most optimistic observers held their breath. Emma whispered something to the mare that no one else could hear. Then, with deliberate steps, Amber Lightning walked up the ramp and into the trailer. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, quickly hushed as they remembered the other nervous horses still waiting their turn. Over the next 2 hours, the entire process was repeated with each Mustang. Some showed more hesitation than others, but with Emma's gentle encouragement and Amber Lightning's apparent example, every horse eventually allowed samples to be taken and entered the trailers without force or restraint. 32 horses, Rachel announced as the last trailer door was secured, all voluntarily participating in genetic sampling and temporary relocation. This has to be a first in wildlife management history. Sheriff Rankin approached, shaking his head in wonder. "I've notified the BLM regional office about this situation. They're sending representatives immediately." "Are we in trouble?" Claire asked, her arm protectively around Emma's shoulders. "Honestly, I don't know," the sheriff admitted. "There's no precedent for this. Technically, you've removed federally managed wildlife from public lands without authorization. But given the environmental emergency declaration and the pending cultural heritage claim," he shrugged. "Let's just say I've seen a lot of strange things in my 30 years wearing this badge, but nothing comes close to this." The caravan of horse trailers prepared to depart for Nate's sanctuary, each vehicle carefully driven by experienced handlers who understood the precious cargo they carried. Emma insisted on riding with Nate in the lead truck, unwilling to be separated from Amber Lightning, who traveled in the first trailer. As they pulled away from the Winters homestead, media vans followed at a respectful distance. The story of the girl and the Mustangs had captured national attention, with live updates being broadcast across major networks. Social media was flooded with video clips of the wild horses voluntarily entering the trailers, clips that experts were already declaring impossible and contrary to everything we know about wild equine behavior. "Does it bother you?" Nate asked Emma as they drove the winding road toward his property. "All these people watching, saying it can't be real." Emma gazed out the window, her expression thoughtful beyond her years. "They just don't understand yet," she said simply. "Amber Lightning says humans forgot how to listen a long time ago." Nate glanced at the child beside him, still struggling to reconcile her ordinary appearance with the extraordinary connection she seemed to share with wild animals. "And you can listen. You can understand what she's thinking." "Not exactly thinking," Emma replied, considering her words carefully. "More like feeling, but bigger feelings than we usually talk about. She feels the history of her ancestors, the safety of her herd, the health of the land." She looked up at Nate. "She remembers you, from when she was hurt. She remembers your kindness." The simple statement sent a chill down Nate's spine. 7 years had passed since he'd found the wounded filly that would become Amber Lightning. He'd treated her from a distance, careful never to habituate her to human presence, never speaking of his actions to anyone. Yet somehow the mare remembered, and had communicated that memory to Emma. As they created the final hill overlooking his property, Nate felt a complex mixture of emotions wash over him. His sanctuary, once a thriving rehabilitation center for injured wild horses, later abandoned after his accident, and the guilt that followed, was about to serve its original purpose once again. The caravan of trailers wound down the gravel drive, past the weathered sign that still read, Sullivan, Wild Horse Sanctuary, despite years of neglect. The main paddock, hastily cleared and repaired just that morning by volunteers, stood ready to receive its first occupants in over a decade. News crews had already established positions along the perimeter, cameras trained on the trailers as they carefully backed up to the unloading areas. Experts from universities, conservation groups, and tribal cultural centers gathered with notepads and recording devices, prepared to document what many were already calling a historic event in human wildlife. Interaction. "Are you nervous?" Nate asked Emma as they parked. She shook her head. "Amber Lightning isn't nervous, so I'm not either." The unloading process was as remarkable as the loading had been. Each Mustang exited their trailer calmly, moving into the sanctuary paddock with none of the typical panic or aggression wild horses display when released into new surroundings. Instead, they gathered in familiar family groups, exploring the boundaries of their temporary home with curious rather than fearful expressions. Amber Lightning was the last to be released. As Emma stood beside the trailer door, the magnificent mare emerged into the sunlight, her golden coat gleaming. Rather than rushing to join her herd, she paused beside the child, lowering her head to touch her muzzle to Emma's hair in what could only be described as a gesture of affection. "They'll be safe here," Emma said, looking up at Nate with complete trust, "until we can prove they belong in the valley. That's what she wants me to tell you." Before Nate could respond, a government SUV with BLM logos pulled into the driveway, followed by two more official vehicles. The moment of reckoning had arrived. "Emma," Claire called, hurrying over to reclaim her daughter as the officials approached. The lead BLM agent, a stern-faced woman in her 40s, surveyed the scene with obvious disbelief. "Sheriff Rankin explained the situation, but I had to see this for myself," she said, observing the Mustangs now peacefully grazing in the paddock. "Do you people realize the federal violations involved in removing an entire herd of protected wild horses from their designated range? Do you realize the federal violations involved in allowing toxic waste to contaminate public lands and water?" "Sources," Rachel countered, stepping forward with her credentials. "We have documented evidence of environmental crimes that directly threatened this herd's survival." "That's a separate issue," the BLM agent began. "No, it's not," Mike interrupted firmly. "These horses led us to the contamination sites. They actively sought human help to protect their habitat, and now they've voluntarily relocated to a sanctuary while we resolve both issues." The agent's skeptical expression made it clear she found this explanation absurd. Wild horses don't seek help or voluntarily relocate. They're animals acting on instinct. Emma moved forward, slipping out of her mother's grasp. "Then how do you explain this?" she asked, walking directly into the paddock through the gate one of the volunteers had left ajar. "Emma!" Claire cried in alarm, but before anyone could stop her, the child was surrounded by wild Mustangs, animals that should have fled from her approach or responded with defensive aggression. Instead, they gathered around her gently, Amber Lightning taking a protective position at her side. It was the Ridge Road scene playing out again, this time before dozens of cameras and scientific observers. A living circle of wild Mustangs, deliberately shielding a human child in their midst. The BLM agent stared in stunned silence, her regulatory concerns momentarily forgotten in the face of something that defied all conventional understanding of wild animal behavior. "Now," Emma said from within her circle of protectors, "can we talk about saving their home?" The image of Emma standing fearlessly within a circle of wild Mustangs traveled across the country within hours. News outlets from local stations to major networks broadcast the footage. Social media platforms exploded with shares and comments, and wildlife experts appeared on countless programs attempting to explain the inexplicable. Inside Nate Sullivan's ranch house, converted into an impromptu conference room, representatives from multiple agencies sat around his worn kitchen table. The BLM's regional director, Patricia Whitman, had arrived to personally assess the situation, bringing with her specialists from the Department of the Interior. They were joined by Rachel Blackhawk, Joseph Redfeather, and tribal representatives. Local officials, including Sheriff Rankin and the core group that had started it all, Nate, the Winters family, and Dr. Kalani. "Let me make sure I understand the sequence of events," Director Whitman said, reviewing her notes. "A 9-year-old girl gets lost, is surrounded and protected by wild mustangs, and then those same mustangs lead a group of civilians to discover illegal toxic waste dumping before voluntarily relocating to a private sanctuary." She looked up, her expression professionally neutral, but unable to completely hide her skepticism. And now, the Shoshone Nation is claiming this specific herd has cultural and historical significance that should exempt it from standard management protocols. "That's correct," Joseph Redfeather confirmed without hesitation. "We've submitted evidence from our oral histories and traditional knowledge that identifies the ancestors of this herd as integral to Shoshone spiritual practices and historical identity. And we're collecting genetic evidence to support that claim," Rachel added. "The DNA samples we obtained today should allow us to establish lineage to the Spanish colonial horses that became part of indigenous culture." Director Whitman turned to Dr. Kalani. "Doctor, you're an expert in ethnobiology. What's your assessment of the behavioral anomalies we're witnessing?" The ethnobiologist chose her words carefully. "These mustangs are displaying behaviors that fall well outside our current scientific understanding of wild equine psychology. The level of apparent coordination, the voluntary interaction with humans, the protective behavior toward the child, these suggest either an extraordinary evolutionary adaptation specific to this herd or—" She hesitated. "Or what?" Whitman. "Unprompted, or our fundamental understanding of animal cognition and interspecies communication is more limited than we've acknowledged." Dr. Kalani gestured toward Emma, who sat quietly listening to the adults. "There are traditions in many indigenous cultures about certain individuals who can communicate with animals. Western science has dismissed these as metaphorical or mythological. But perhaps we've been too quick to judge." Whitman sighed, clearly struggling to reconcile regulatory responsibilities with the extraordinary evidence before her. "While this is all fascinating from a scientific perspective, I have practical considerations." The scheduled roundup was based on range management assessments showing the ecosystem cannot sustainably support both this herd and the existing cattle grazing operations. "Those assessments were manipulated," Mike Winters stated firmly. "Dixon Energy funded those studies with the explicit goal of clearing the mustangs from land they wanted for development." "That's a serious accusation," Whitman replied. Sheriff Rankin placed a thick folder on the table. "One supported by evidence seized during our investigation. Dixon's internal emails explicitly discuss scientific results shopping to find researchers who would provide the conclusions they wanted." As the discussion continued, Claire noticed Emma slipping quietly out the side door. Following her daughter onto the porch, she found Emma gazing toward the paddock, where the mustangs grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. "You okay, sweetie?" Claire asked, sitting beside her. Emma nodded. "They're talking too much. Amber Lightning says sometimes humans use words to avoid understanding." Claire studied her daughter's face, still coming to terms with the transformation that had occurred since the encounter on the Ridge Road. "Emma, how do you know what she's thinking? Really?" The girl considered this carefully. "It's like when You know something without being told, like how you always know when I'm sad even if I'm trying to hide it. She pointed to the Palomino mare, who had raised her head to look directly at them. She shares her feelings with me, and they're so clear they become words in my mind. Before Claire could respond, a vehicle approached on the gravel drive. An expensive black SUV that seemed out of place among the government cars and local trucks. When it parked, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s emerged, accompanied by a younger woman carrying a briefcase. "Who's that?" Emma asked. Claire recognized him immediately. "That's George Dixon, Brandon's father, and the CEO of Dixon Energy." Inside, the arrival of George Dixon created immediate tension. The elder Dixon carried himself with the confident authority of someone accustomed to controlling rooms and outcomes. His daughter, Margaret Dixon, who served as the company's chief legal counsel, stood protectively at his side. Director Whitman, George greeted the BLM official with practiced cordiality before acknowledging the others with a perfunctory nod. "I apologize for interrupting, but given the situation's impact on our company's operations, I felt my presence was warranted." "Mr. Dixon," Whitman replied professionally, "we're discussing the status of the Mustang herd and related environmental concerns." "Yes, the unfortunate situation my son created," Dixon said smoothly. "Let me first state unequivocally that Dixon Energy had no corporate knowledge of Brandon's illegal activities. We're cooperating fully with authorities and have already established a remediation fund for the contaminated areas." "How generous," Nate commented dryly. "And your plans for developing the valley?" Dixon's smile remained fixed. "We're re-evaluating our approach in light of recent events, which brings me to why I'm here." He turned to Joseph Redfeather. "The Shoshone Nation's cultural claim to this Mustang herd presents an interesting situation, one I believe we can resolve. To everyone's satisfaction, Margaret Dixon opened her briefcase, distributing folders to everyone at the table. Dixon Energy is prepared to fund a dedicated Mustang preserve on a portion of the BLM land, co-managed by the Shoshone Nation and relevant federal agencies. We would adjust our development plans to exclude this area, creating a permanent sanctuary for the herd." Rachel Blackhawk flipped through the proposal, her expression skeptical. "This preserve would be approximately 1/3 the size of their current range, but with enhanced water sources and carefully managed grazing conditions," Margaret countered. "Our environmental consultants project it could sustainably support the current herd size indefinitely." "In exchange for what?" Sheriff Rankin asked bluntly. George Dixon spread his hands in a gesture of transparency. "In exchange for dropping opposition to our revised development plan and, of course, resolving any potential litigation regarding the contamination incidents." The room fell silent as the offer sank in. It was a shrewd maneuver, offering enough to appear generous while still securing the most valuable portions of the valley for development. The silence was broken by Emma's voice from the doorway. "It's not enough," she said clearly. "Amber Lightning says their home isn't just where they eat and sleep. It's all the places their ancestors have traveled for generations." All eyes turned to the child. Dixon's expression softened into the condescending smile adults often use with children they consider charming but irrelevant. "Young lady, I understand you formed a special bond with these horses. That's why we want to create a safe place for them." "A cage," Emma corrected without hesitation. "A pretty cage with food and water, but still a cage." Dixon's daughter stepped in, her legal training evident in her careful response. "It's not a cage, Emma. It's a protected area where the Mustangs would be safe from roundups and competition. With cattle, but separate from the land that holds their memories," Joseph Redfeather interjected, understanding Emma's point immediately. In our traditions, animals aren't just bodies that need food and water. They carry the spiritual history of the land itself. Director Whitman cleared her throat. While I respect indigenous perspectives, I need to make decisions based on measurable factors: range capacity, water resources, competing land uses. Then measure this, Dr. Kalani suggested, turning her tablet toward the director. On screen was footage from earlier that day. Wild mustangs calmly allowing blood samples to be drawn, voluntarily entering trailers, forming a protective circle around Emma. How do we quantify this level of behavioral adaptation? These aren't just animals responding to environmental pressures. They're demonstrating problem-solving, communication and cooperation at a level our science doesn't yet understand. George Dixon's carefully maintained patience began to fray. With all due respect, we're talking about horses, not people. The fact that they've formed some unusual attachment to this child is fascinating, but ultimately irrelevant to land management decisions. Irrelevant, Nate challenged, his voice quiet but intense. These animals recognized environmental contamination that your company's sophisticated testing equipment supposedly missed. They organized themselves to protect a lost child. They're showing intelligence and awareness that challenges everything we thought we knew about them. And you think that's irrelevant? Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the sanctuary. Through the window, they could see Amber Lightning standing at the fence, her golden coat burnished by the fading light, her gaze fixed on the house as if aware of the discussions determining her herd's fate. There's something else you should. And no, Emma said, looking directly at George Dixon with an unsettling clarity. Amber Lightning remembers your father. Dixon blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Excuse me? Your father, Thomas Dixon. He came to this valley in 1952. He was the first one to find copper in the hills, where the Mustangs live. Amber Lightning's great-grandmother knew him. She watched him mark the rocks with red paint. The room fell utterly silent. George Dixon stared at the child, his composed exterior cracking for the first time. How could you possibly know that? My father's initial survey was never made public. He used red paint to mark promising deposits decades before founding the company. Emma held his gaze steadily. The horses remember. They pass their memories down through generations. They remember everyone who has tried to take their home away. In that moment, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room, a realization that they were dealing with something that transcended ordinary policy discussions or corporate negotiations. This wasn't just about land use or environmental regulations. It was about a connection between species that challenged the very foundations of how humans understood their relationship with the natural world. And somehow, a 9-year-old girl had become the interpreter of that challenge. George Dixon's composure returned quickly, his momentary shock at Emma's knowledge of his father's activities replaced by the practiced control of a seasoned executive. A charming coincidence, he said dismissively. My father's early prospecting adventures are part of company law. The child must have heard stories somewhere. We've never discussed your family history, Claire responded firmly. Emma has had no access to information about your father or his activities in this valley. Director Whitman cleared her throat. While this is fascinating, we need to stay focused on present regulatory considerations. The BLM has a legal mandate to manage these lands for multiple uses, including energy development, recreation, and wildlife conservation, and cultural preservation. Joseph Redfeather reminded her. The 2009 amendments to the Wild Horse and Burro Act specifically acknowledge indigenous cultural connections as a consideration in management decisions. As the meeting continued, the tension between competing interests became increasingly clear. The BLM was caught between its mandate to follow established regulations and the unprecedented situation unfolding before them. Dixon Energy had the political connections and legal resources to push their agenda forward despite the scandal. And in the middle stood a herd of wild mustangs who had somehow transcended their expected role as simple wildlife to become active participants in their own fate. Night had fallen by the time the officials departed, with Director Whitman promising a formal response within 48 hours. George Dixon left with a thin-lipped smile that suggested the battle was far from over. Only Sheriff Rankin lingered, conferring quietly with Mike about security arrangements for both the sanctuary and the Winters homestead. "We've got deputies patrolling the access roads," the sheriff explained. "Media's being kept at the main gate, but I'm concerned about Dixon. Men like that don't like losing, and he seemed rattled by what Emma said about his father." "You think he might try something?" Nate asked. The sheriff chose his words carefully. "Let's just say I've known the Dixon family for 30 years. They didn't build that company by accepting defeat gracefully." After the sheriff departed, the core group gathered on Nate's porch, watching the moonlight illuminate the paddock where the Mustangs rested. Emma had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, exhausted by the day's events. "What happens now?" Claire asked, gently stroking her daughter's hair. Rachel sighed, reviewing her notes from the meeting. "Director Whitman seems genuinely conflicted. The evidence we've gathered, the video documentation, preliminary genetic results, the tribal, historical claims. It's compelling, but Dixon Energy has immense influence with the Department of the Interior. And now they've offered a compromise," Mike added. "The preserve idea is designed to make them look reasonable while still giving them access to the most valuable resources." Joseph Redfeather gazed thoughtfully at the sleeping child. "The horses chose Emma for a reason. They recognized something. In her, a capacity to bridge worlds that most humans have forgotten how to access." Dr. Kalani nodded in agreement. "There are numerous accounts across cultures of children serving as intermediaries between humans and the natural world. Western science has dismissed these as folklore, but perhaps we've been too quick to judge." Nate, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "When I found Amber Lightning 7 years ago, she was barely alive. Gunshot wound to the shoulder, infection setting in. I treated her from a distance, careful never to let her associate humans with food or safety." He paused, remembering. "The last day I saw her, before she rejoined wild horses passing through, she stood at the edge of my property and looked back at me. I always felt she was acknowledging what had happened between us, that she understood. And now she's brought her entire herd to you for protection," Rachel observed. "That can't be a coincidence." A soft sound from the paddock drew their attention. Amber Lightning had approached the fence, her form silvered by moonlight. The mare stood watching the house, particularly the sleeping child, with an intensity that seemed impossible to dismiss as mere animal curiosity. "She's worried." Emma's drowsy voice startled them. The girl had awakened and was looking directly at the Palomino. "She says they're coming tonight." "Who's coming, honey?" Claire asked, immediately alert. "Men who want to make the Mustangs disappear," Emma replied, her voice carrying the strange, adult quality it took on when she spoke of her communications with the horses. "They think if the horses are gone, all the problems will go away too." Mike was already reaching for his phone to call Sheriff Rankin when the distant sound of engines broke the night's stillness. Multiple vehicles approached from the access road that wound through the hills behind Nate's property, not the main entrance where the sheriff's deputies were stationed. "Get inside," Nate ordered sharply, reaching for the rifle he kept mounted above his door. "Mike, call Rankin. Tell him we have intruders on the north access." The scene quickly transformed from peaceful evening to crisis response. Claire hurried Emma into the house, while Rachel and Dr. Kalani gathered their documentation and equipment. Joseph moved with surprising speed for his age, helping Mike secure the doors and windows. Outside, the Mustang herd had come fully alert, moving restlessly in the paddock as the sound of engines grew louder. Amber Lightning paced along the fence line, her agitation clear even to those without Emma's special connection. 4 vehicles, Nate reported, peering through binoculars into the darkness. Heavy-duty trucks, no lights. They're coming in through the back range. Sheriff says his nearest unit is 15 minutes out, Mike reported grimly. Inside, Emma broke, away from her mother's protective hold. "We need to let the horses out," she insisted. "They have to be free to protect themselves." "Honey, the horses are safer in the paddock," Claire tried to reason. "If they're released, these men might hurt them." Emma's eyes filled with tears of frustration. "You don't understand. Amber Lightning says they need to be free. They have a plan." The adults exchanged uncertain glances, the familiar dilemma of whether to trust the child's inexplicable connection. With the Mustangs now heightened by immediate danger, the decision was made for them when the first shots rang out, not aimed at the house, but at the paddock fencing. Under cover of darkness, the intruders had positioned themselves around the perimeter and were methodically destroying the barriers containing the Mustang herd. "They're trying to scatter the horses," Rachel realized. "If the herd disperses across open country, they'll be impossible to gather again," Nate finished grimly. "And the BLM will have no choice but to classify them as estray animals, subject to standard roundup protocols." Through the window, they could see muzzle flashes as more shots were fired at the fencing. The Mustangs bunched together in the center of the paddock, but surprisingly they weren't panicking, as would be expected. Instead, they were gathering in formation around Amber Lightning, who stood tall despite the chaos erupting around them. "I need to go to them," Emma pleaded, struggling against her mother's restraining arms. "Absolutely not," Claire replied firmly. "It's too dangerous." Joseph Redfeather moved to the window, observing the Mustang's behavior with intense interest. "Look at them," he said quietly. "They're not running, they're organizing." Indeed, the herd was moving with astonishing coordination, forming concentric circles with the youngest foals protected in the center, surrounded by rings of mares, yearlings, and the few stallions. It was a defensive formation that seemed impossible for wild animals to create spontaneously under stress. More fence panels fell under the intruders' assault. Within minutes, the entire eastern section of the paddock lay open to the night, an escape route leading to the open range beyond. Yet still, the Mustangs held their position, waiting. "What are they doing?" Mike wondered aloud, watching through. The window alongside Joseph, Emma's voice came clear and certain. "They're waiting for the right moment. Amber Lightning says sometimes you have to let the enemy think they're winning." As if on cue, the intruders' vehicles began moving again, their headlights suddenly blazing to life as they positioned themselves to herd the Mustangs toward the open fence line and into the night. It was a coordinated operation, clearly planned, to exploit the chaos and disperse the herd beyond recovery. What happened next would be replayed on news broadcasts across the country for weeks to come, captured by the security cameras Nate had installed around his property, instead of fleeing. In terror, as the vehicles converged, the Mustang herd suddenly moved as one, not away from the intruders, but directly toward them in a unified charge. Amber Lightning led the surge, her golden form gleaming under the headlights as she fearlessly raced toward the lead truck. The driver, clearly unprepared for wild prey to transform into coordinated attackers, swerved sharply to avoid collision. His truck careened into one of the other vehicles, creating a chain reaction as the other drivers similarly panicked and lost control. Within moments, the careful operation had dissolved into chaos. One truck became stuck in a drainage ditch, another rolled onto its side, and the remaining two collided with each other as their drivers attempted to retreat from the advancing horses. The Mustangs didn't pursue the disabled vehicles. Instead, They maintained a protective formation around the paddock's perimeter, effectively creating a barrier between the intruders and their own vulnerable members. "They're defending their territory," Dr. Kalani whispered in awe, "not just reacting, but strategizing." In the distance, the welcome sound of sirens announced the sheriff's approach. The intruders abandoned their disabled vehicles, fleeing into the darkness on foot, rather than face capture and identification. As the sheriff's cars arrived with lights flashing, Amber Lightning let out a piercing whinny that echoed across the property. The Mustang herd, having successfully repelled the threat, calmly returned to the center of the paddock as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Did you see that?" Rachel asked, her scientific detachment momentarily forgotten in the face of something that defied explanation. They didn't run. They didn't panic. They coordinated a defense that protected their vulnerable members and drove off the threat, they remembered, Emma said softly, as the adults struggled to process what they had witnessed. "Amber Lightning says their ancestors did the same thing to protect themselves from hunters hundreds of years ago. They've always known how to fight back. They just choose not to most of the time." Outside, as Sheriff Rankin's deputies secured the scene and began documenting the abandoned vehicles, Amber Lightning stood, watching the house. In the blue-red flash of emergency lights, her intelligent eyes seemed to hold a message for those within, a reminder that the wild creatures humans so often dismissed as simple animals were perhaps something far more complex, carrying ancestral wisdom and capabilities that modern society had forgotten how to recognize, and through Emma, they were finally making themselves understood. Dawn broke over Nate Sullivan's sanctuary, illuminating a property transformed overnight. News vans lined the main road, held back by sheriff's deputies. Environmental investigators processed the abandoned vehicles from the previous night's attack, and at the center of it all, the Mustang herd grazed peacefully in the paddock, as if nothing unusual had occurred. "We've identified the vehicles," Sheriff Rankin informed the group gathered in Nate's kitchen. "All registered to shell companies with paper trails leading back to subsidiary contractors used by Dixon Energy." "Can you prove George Dixon ordered the attack?" Mike asked. The sheriff shook his head. "Not yet, but we've got 4 suspects in custody. Security contractors who claimed they were hired to relocate nuisance wildlife that was interfering with company operations." "Relocate," Claire repeated bitterly. "They were trying to scatter the herd across 3 counties. As they discussed next steps, Director Whitman's government SUV pulled into the driveway. The BLM official had driven straight from the regional office after receiving news of the night's events, her expression grim as she entered the house. "I've been on the phone with the Secretary of the Interior since 5 a.m., she announced without preamble. "Last night's incident has escalated this situation to the highest levels," Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Because someone tried to illegally disperse federally protected wild horses. Because everything about this case has shattered precedent," Whitman corrected. "The horses' behavior, their apparent coordination, the indigenous heritage claims, Dixon Energy's involvement, none of this follows established management protocols." Through the window, they could see Emma in the paddock, moving among the wild Mustangs with complete confidence. Amber Lightning stood beside her protectively, as the child checked each horse for injuries from the night's confrontation. "She shouldn't be in there alone," Whitman said, professional concern overriding her skepticism. "She's not alone," Joseph replied simply. "She's with family." The director stared at the elderly tribal leader, then back at the child surrounded by wild horses that should, by all scientific understanding, be avoiding human contact at all costs. "I've made my decision," she said finally. "As of this morning, I've issued an emergency stay on the scheduled roundup, pending full investigation of both the environmental contamination and the cultural heritage claims." A current of cautious relief ran through the room. It wasn't a permanent victory, but it was a crucial reprieve. Additionally, Whitman continued, I've authorized the establishment of a joint scientific and cultural study group to document and analyze the behavior of this specific herd. Dr. Kalani, Ms. Blackhawk, I'm hoping you'll both participate. What about Dixon Energy's development plans? Nate asked. That's where things get complicated, Whitman admitted. The company still holds valid permits for portions of the valley. However, she allowed herself a small smile. The Secretary has initiated a formal review of those permits in light of the environmental violations. That process typically takes 6 to 12 months, during which all development activities are suspended. Mike let out a low whistle. Dixon won't be happy about that. Dixon has bigger problems, Sheriff Rankin interjected, checking his phone. FBI just served search warrants at their corporate headquarters. Apparently, the illegal waste disposal operation extends well beyond our valley. As the sheriff's cars arrived with lights flashing, Amber Lightning let out a piercing whinny that echoed across the property. The Mustang herd, having successfully repelled the threat, calmly returned to the center of the paddock as if nothing unusual had occurred. Did you see that? Rachel asked, her scientific detachment momentarily forgotten in the face of something that defied explanation. They didn't run. They didn't panic. They coordinated a defense that protected their vulnerable members and drove off the threat. They remembered, Emma said softly, as the adults struggled to process what they had witnessed. Amber Lightning says their ancestors did the same thing to protect themselves from hunters hundreds of years ago. They've always known how to fight back. They just choose not to most of the time. Outside, as Sheriff Rankin's deputies secured the scene and began documenting the abandoned vehicles, Amber Lightning stood watching the house. In the blue-red flash of emergency lights, her intelligent eyes seemed to hold a message for those within, a reminder that the wild creatures humans so often dismissed as simple animals were perhaps something far more complex, carrying ancestral wisdom and capabilities that modern society had forgotten how to recognize, and through Emma, they were finally making themselves understood. Dawn broke over Nate Sullivan's sanctuary, illuminating a property transformed overnight. News vans lined the main road, held back by sheriff's deputies. Environmental investigators processed the abandoned vehicles from the previous night's attack. And at the center of it all, the Mustang herd grazed peacefully in the paddock as if nothing unusual had occurred. We've identified the vehicles, Sheriff Rankin informed the group gathered in Nate's kitchen. All registered to shell companies with paper trails leading back to subsidiary contractors used by Dixon Energy. Can you prove George Dixon ordered the attack? Mike asked. The sheriff shook his head. Not yet, but we've got 4 suspects in custody, security contractors who claim they were hired to relocate nuisance wildlife that was interfering with company operations. Relocate, Claire repeated bitterly. They were trying to scatter the herd across 3 counties. As they discussed next steps, Director Whitman's government SUV pulled into the driveway. The BLM official had driven straight from the regional office after receiving news of the night's events, her expression grim as she entered the house. I've been on the phone with the Secretary of the Interior since 5 a.m., she announced without preamble. Last night's incident has escalated this situation to the highest levels. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Because someone tried to illegally disperse federally protected wild horses. Because everything about this case has shattered precedent, Whitman corrected. The horses' behavior, their apparent coordination, the indigenous heritage claims, Dixon Energy's involvement, none of this follows established management protocols. Through the window, they could see Emma in the paddock, moving among the wild Mustangs with complete confidence. Amber Lightning stood beside her protectively, as the child checked each horse for injuries from the night's confrontation. She shouldn't be in there alone, Whitman said. professional concern overriding her skepticism. "She's not alone," Joseph replied simply. "She's with family." The director stared at the elderly tribal leader, then back at the child surrounded by wild horses that should, by all scientific understanding, be avoiding human contact at all costs. "I've made my decision," she said finally. "As of this morning, I've issued an emergency stay on the scheduled roundup, pending full investigation of both the environmental contamination and the cultural heritage claims." A current of cautious relief ran through the room. It wasn't a permanent victory, but it was a crucial reprieve. "Additionally," Whitman continued, "I've authorized the establishment of a joint scientific and cultural study group to document and analyze the behavior of this specific herd. Dr. Kalani, Ms. Blackhawk, I'm hoping you'll both participate." "What about Dixon Energy's development plans?" Nate asked. "That's where things get complicated," Whitman admitted. "The company still holds valid permits for portions of the valley. However," she allowed herself a small smile, "the secretary has initiated a formal review of those permits in light of the environmental violations. That process typically takes 6 to 12 months, during which all development activities are suspended." Mike let out a low whistle. "Dixon won't be happy about that." "Dixon has bigger problems," Sheriff Rankin interjected, checking his phone. "FBI just served search warrants at their corporate headquarters. Apparently, the illegal waste disposal operation extends well beyond our valley." As the adults discussed the policy implications, Emma entered the kitchen, her small face serious beyond her years. "Director Whitman," she said politely, "Amber Lightning wants to show you something, all of you actually." The adults exchanged bemused glances, but Emma's unwavering certainty had become difficult to dismiss after everything they had witnessed. One by one, they followed her out to the paddock. The Mustang herd had gathered near the eastern fence, facing the distant copper hills that had given the valley its name. Amber Lightning stood at their head, her posture alert and expectant. "What are we supposed to be seeing?" Whitman asked skeptically. "Wait," Emma replied, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Minutes passed in silence. Then, just as the adults' patience began to wane, movement appeared on the distant ridge, horses, at least a dozen, making their way down toward the sanctuary. "Another Mustang herd," Rachel identified, raising her binoculars. "But they should be territorial competitors, not allies," Emma finished for her. "But they are. Amber Lightning called them." "Called them how?" Dr. Kalani asked, her scientific curiosity fully engaged. Emma shrugged. "The same way she talks to me. They can hear each other across much greater distances than we can. They've been doing it for generations." As they watched in amazement, the new herd approached the fence line. They didn't display the aggressive posturing typical when rival Mustang groups meet, but instead moved with the same coordinated purpose that had characterized Amber Lightning's herd. "There are 3 more herds coming," Emma announced calmly, "from the North Valley, the Western Canyon, and the High Meadows. All of them." "All of them?" Director Whitman repeated. "What does that mean?" "All the Mustangs in Copper Creek Valley," Joseph Redfeather realized, understanding dawning on his weathered face. "They're gathering." Over the next hour, the prophecy proved true. From every direction, wild horses appeared, small family groups, bachelor bands, mixed herds that normally kept to isolated pockets of the valley. By mid-morning, over 100 Mustangs had gathered around the perimeter of Nate's sanctuary, creating a living demonstration of their true numbers and distribution across the region. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the unprecedented gathering live across the country. Social media exploded with images of the assembled horses, their numbers far exceeding official BLM population estimates. "This is impossible," Director Whitman murmured, her regulatory certainty crumbling in the face of something so far beyond normal wildlife behavior. "They're deliberately showing us their full population, their true range across the valley." "They're making their case," Rachel said quietly, "just as effectively as any human legal team could." George Dixon's arrival was almost anticlimactic. His black SUV pulled up to the property line, but he didn't immediately exit. Through the tinted windows, they could see him speaking animatedly on his phone, his composed facade finally cracking. As he surveyed the scene before him, 100 wild mustangs assembled in silent testimony, news helicopters broadcasting it all, and a ring of law enforcement vehicles surrounding his trapped contractors. When he finally approached, his daughter Margaret was noticeably absent. In her place was an older man, distinguished and grave, who introduced himself as Preston Hamilton, chairman of Dixon Energy's board of directors. "Director Whitman," Hamilton acknowledged with a curt nod. "The board has called an emergency session in light of recent events. Mr. Dixon has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation." George Dixon's face flushed with anger. "This is absurd, Preston. My family built this company and nearly destroyed it." Hamilton cut him off sharply. "The FBI is examining 2 decades of environmental violations on your watch. The stock has dropped 30% since yesterday's arrests. The board has authorized me to pursue immediate settlement options." The corporate power play unfolded swiftly. Hamilton outlined a comprehensive proposal. Dixon Energy would withdraw all development permits in Copper Creek Valley, establish a substantial remediation fund for the contaminated areas, and transfer certain land rights to a newly formed conservation trust. "In exchange," he concluded, "we seek immunity from further prosecution for the company itself, though not for individuals found directly responsible for criminal acts." Sheriff Rankin glanced at Director Whitman. "That's above my pay grade." "Mine, too," she admitted, "but I'll convey the offer to the Secretary and Department of Justice." As the negotiations continued, Emma slipped away to stand beside Amber Lightning at the fence. The Palomino mare lowered her head, gently pressing her muzzle against the child's hair in a gesture that somehow conveyed both affection and gravity. "What happens now?" Nate asked, joining them. "After the lawyers and officials leave, after the news cameras move on to the next story. What happens to you and Amber Lightning?" Emma considered this thoughtfully. "She says our paths are connected now, not just hers and mine, but all of us who helped save their home." The girl looked up at him with those unnervingly wise eyes. "She says you need to reopen your sanctuary, not to keep wild horses in, but to heal the ones who need help before they return to freedom." Nate gazed across his property, seeing it not as it was, worn and neglected after years of his self-imposed isolation, but as it could be again, a place of healing and reconnection, both for injured wild horses and for humans who had forgotten how to listen to the natural world. One by one, the assembled Mustang herds began to depart, melting back into the landscape from which they had emerged. Only Amber Lightning's herd remained, watching over Emma as they had since finding her alone and afraid on that deserted Montana road. The child who had once been lost had become the guide. The horses who had once been threatened had become the protectors. And in their unlikely alliance, they had reminded an entire community that the boundaries between species were perhaps far more permeable than modern humans had allowed themselves to believe. As the sun reached its zenith, casting the valley in golden light, Amber Lightning finally turned away from the fence, leading her herd toward the open gate that would return them to their ancestral range. She paused at the threshold, looking back one last time at Emma, Nate, and the gathered humans who had become unexpected allies in their struggle. In that moment of connection between child and wild mare, something ancient and nearly forgotten was remembered. A time when humans and animals shared not just the land, but understanding. A time before words created separation, when communication flows directly from heart to heart across the boundaries of species. The Palomino mare tossed her head once, her mane catching the sunlight like liquid gold, then led her family home across The valley they had successfully defended, wild and free, just as they were meant to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.